Step into the world of Curious Counter, where spooky stories and mysteries await. Get ready to explore strange and creepy things that might give you goosebumps, puzzling secrets and things that make you scared, what's hidden in the shadows, and learn about the not-so-normal side of our everyday world, if you're up for it. Here are some scary investigation and crime stories you would like to listen. My girlfriend and I had been going through a rough patch for a few weeks, arguing continuously, having screaming matches with one another, or not speaking at all. It all started when she brought up the topic of conceiving a child, and trying to be logical, I shot the entire idea down. I didn't believe we were financially stable enough to provide for the child's basic needs, let alone be able to give the proper affection and tedious care that a child needs and deserves. She argued that she could be a stay-at-home mom and provide the proper care for the child while simultaneously maintaining the home responsibilities so that some weight would be lifted off my shoulders. But I saw it for what it was, wishful thinking. I'd have to work 60 to 70-hour weeks just to make ends meet without pulling money from savings. I wasn't having it. I barely got any time to myself as it was. And as of late, I had barely been able to spend as much time as I had wanted to with my girlfriend. There was no way I was going to have a child. Not only that, but I respect and value the role of a father, believing that it wouldn't be fair to either of us or the child to barely have the time to be a valuable presence in my child's upbringing. We argued on, trying to force one another to give in to the other's resolution. But we were both stubborn, so that resolution never came. Anger, resentment, and sadness have filled the silent air for weeks since that day. I wanted to end this bitterness between us, but I didn't know how to fix it. While driving home from another exhausting 14-hour shift at the construction site, I pondered how I could fix the situation between Maria and me, but nothing came to mind. Agitated yet determined, I decided I wasn't going home without a firm solution. I took a left turn onto a rocky back road leading into the serene country forests, hoping that the calming scenery would clear my head and spark an idea. After an hour or so of cruising on the empty, snow-covered road, I finally felt the tension in my body and mind begin to ease up and settle into a relaxed state, the more I admired the natural beauty ever expanding around me. Suddenly, I realized I had not let Maria know that I would be late coming home. So I shot her a text saying, "Hey babe, I need to clear my head. I'll be a few hours late." I wanted to say more but didn't know what else to say. Almost immediately after I sent it, I heard the ding on my phone with a reply of a rolling eyes emoji and her stating that dinner was wrapped up in the microwave for me. I smiled despite the sarcasm and put my phone down, deciding to pull over at the base of the tree line so that I could sit and think. I closed my eyes so that I could concentrate, but that only made me drowsy, and I ended up drifting off to sleep. A loud bang rang throughout the inside of my truck, snapping my eyes open and pointing in the direction the sound had come from. Although I had left my truck running, it did not provide enough heat to melt the snow blocking the driver's side window, so I was unable to see who or what had made the startling noise. I stared anxiously at the sheet of snow between us until I saw a pile of snow get swiftly scraped off my window. Instinctively, I began to roll down my window and was immediately greeted with a wide-eyed stare from an odd-looking gypsy. I had to stare pretty hard to make out his features since a black sky stretched overhead, and this back road in the deep country lacked streetlights. We gazed at one another for a while as an uncomfortable silence permeated the air between us. My gut instinct grew very alarmed. He suddenly raised an old lit-up Gothic lantern, which revealed the intricacies of his face, and made me push myself away from him. He looked ancient and rather sickly. His sharp face was covered in a thin layer of wrinkled, pale skin that looked extremely oily despite the freezing temperatures and his age. Before I could say anything, he began to speak, and to my surprise, he spoke quite fluently and with a tone of elegance, saying, I'm glad to see you're healthy, sir. I've been traveling with my daughter out in the country for many years now, and whenever we stumble across a lone vehicle in the night, well, it's never a pretty sight. As he was talking, I took a quick peek over his shoulder due to a moving light behind him, and I saw the shadow of a young woman's pale, ghostly face with shining emerald eyes peek from a small circular window of a camouflaged black caravan. I averted my eyes quickly towards another moving object. Fastened by ropes was a pitch-black horse staring straight into my eyes and breathing abnormally heavily. I brought my attention back to the sickly man in front of me and muttered out, "Oh yeah, I imagine it's not safe out here during these hours." But before I could finish speaking, I interrupted myself due to a shift I saw in the man's eyes. It was only for half a second, but it was as if excitement washed over his entire face, which made the blood in his body rush around the tight skin around his eyes, making the purple veins pop out. But his face had shifted back to normal just as quickly as the shift had started. My body from the neck down was stricken by paralyzing fear, and I knew in that moment that he was a threat. Yet I attempted to showcase courage and quickly stuttered out, thanks for checking on us. Get up on me. I have to go home now. I fell asleep for too long." Before I could say more, he interrupted me with a soft chuckle while looking dead into my eyes, while slightly raising his lantern, revealing his own pale silver eyes. He quickly reached his hand through the window, grasping my shoulder, and began to give it a pat. His hand was slick with what appeared to be slabs of oil and smeared with dirt, and he quickly turned away towards his caravan, while saying he'd got a gift he'd like to give me. My thoughts were damn near screaming for me to get out of there. I was surprised they weren't echoing out of my head. Rampant anxiety and nervousness intensified within me to a degree I had never felt before in my entire life. I was unable to control my shaking limbs. It felt as if I had lost all control of my motor functions, while that urging voice in my head grew louder and louder. "Get out. Leave now. Get the hell out of this place." But I couldn't move my limbs on my own. It was all involuntary. I had lost all control. The only thing I could do was keep my hyper-focused attention on him as he approached the caravan, reached his dirt hand through the black shade entrance, and remained in that position, jostling his hand around. All the worst-case scenarios played through my mind as I wondered what he could be reaching for. Was it a gun? Was he going to blow my damn head off? Was it a knife or machete so that he could cut my head clean off and then cut my lifeless body open to eat me? I could do nothing but wonder and watch. Eventually he pulled his hand back, revealing a radiant emerald-colored candle that shone radiantly through the black of the night. The old man's face wore a wide, tight-lipped grin, and when he stood next to my evidently shaking body, he said, "Ladies love a nice gift every now and then. Take this, my friend." I don't know how, but surprisingly, my paralyzing fear and nervousness emptied out of my body almost entirely after hearing those words. My eyes fixed on the ethereal glow of the emerald-colored candle. It seemed otherworldly. I had never seen anything like it before, and was quite surprised that it was a candle in the first place. But more importantly, I knew Maria would love it. Part of me still felt weary about the odd man. I mean, how did he know I had a girlfriend? How did he know this was exactly what I needed? I must have been admiring the candle and being lost in thought for a while, because when I turned back towards the window to thank the man, I saw no one, only the straps connecting the caravan, and the horse rose and snapped, and the caravan seemed to glide away, blending into the vast darkness of the night. I just sat there in my truck, taking a big sigh of relief. It took me a while to console myself as I contemplated the events that had just occurred. I condemned myself harshly for allowing myself to be so careless. That could have been a goddamn murderer, and you just rolled your window down to some stranger in the middle of nowhere. You are truly a different breed of Morin, and you're lucky to be alive, is what I told myself before taking a long journey back home. I checked my phone and saw no missed calls, no texts, and not a single notification. I don't know why, but that made me uneasy. I tried calling Maria, but got no answer. I figured she had just fallen asleep, so I let it go. Yet my mind kept replaying the strange interaction I had just undergone. The more I thought about it, the more I thought about how disastrous it all could have turned out. But ultimately, part of me was thankful to be alive. At least I had a gift for my girlfriend. I knew she'd like it. What kind of girl doesn't like candles? Although I didn't know what to say to her, I believed the gift would speak the words that I couldn't and would help reconcile the two of us. With that thought, I retained hope and enjoyed a rather peaceful drive home. I had finally pulled into the driveway, breathing a huge sigh of both relief and exhaustion. No lights were on in the house, which brought a little tinge of sadness to me. Part of me wished that Maria was still awake so that I could give her the gift and put this whole stressful situation to a close. Before disengaging the truck, I glanced at the time. It was 2:22 a.m. A memory shot through my mind of the time Maria told me it meant I had guardian angels looking over me. I didn't believe in that mumbo-jumbo nonsense, but I couldn't help but crack a smile as I said to myself, I hope you're looking after me. I'm going to need it if I have any hope of fixing this. Stepping out of the truck, I took another glance at the house, and I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me along with the urge to smoke a cigarette. So I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled one out, and lit it as I leaned against the tailgate of my truck, looking up at the ethereal night sky. I can't explain it, but for the first time in a long while, I was completely enamored by a feeling of existential exultation instead of grueling agony. As I watched the slight twinkle of the stars, I counted them silently through the mist of my cold, smoky breath. I felt my body begin to subtly vibrate as the rare feeling of joy washed over me. I smiled up at the heavens, feeling as if they were returning countless smiles to me. A sudden tap on the back of my shoulder startled me. I shot my eyes behind me and saw Maria smiling at me. Her beautiful pale complexion was illuminated by streaks of moonlight, and her eyes were now a luminous silver, staring into mine. She wore a black bathrobe that subtly teased the naked body beneath, which added to her intricate beauty. I hadn't seen her smile at me since before our fight, and I didn't realize how much I missed seeing it until that moment. We gazed into each other's eyes for a while, soaking in one another's presence, which could only be compared to ecstasy. Without a word, she slowly walked closer, never shifting her gaze from mine, until she stood right before me, reaching her pale hand up and gliding her soft skin up my neck, which sent chills all throughout me. She rested her touch on the corner of my mouth, caressing it, then sneakily took the cigarette from it and proceeded to take a drag as she turned her head towards the heavens, all while my eyes remained fixated on her, with heaven standing before me. Raw, limitless passion coursed through my body as I admired her. She didn't seem to mind. She was looking away from me, but she knew what I was doing. A slight smile peeked out of the corner of her mouth, but I noticed an iridescent tear swell in her eye, then proceed to drip down her pale cheek. She wiped it away before I could reach up and do it for her. Then she carefully turned her face towards me and broke the comforting silence by saying, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I could tell she wanted to say more, but more tears began to fall as she lowered her head in grief while backing away from me. She attempted to raise her eyes towards mine, but it seemed as if she couldn't bring herself to do it for reasons I didn't quite understand at the time. As she looked at the ground, overcome by hysteria, she managed to mutter out, "I made a mistake I can't fix. I love you more than anything in this world, and I'm sorry I can't take it back." Mere drops of tears turned into overflowing streams. She cried more than I've ever seen from anyone in my entire life. Concerned and confused, I tried to take a step towards her so that I could embrace her, but she hastily backed away further and then began sprinting into the dark house. I was caught off guard and beyond bewildered, yet instinctively I took off after her. She was abnormally fast. She had already made it to the front door when I had just started running after her, proceeding to slam it shut. I made it inside while calling her name with concern in my voice. Not a single light throughout the entirety of the house was illuminated, and I heard no frantic sobbing or any indication at all that somebody was home. Only the white noise droning from the air conditioner could be heard. I looked around while shouting her name in the dark, but still heard nothing. This behavior from Maria was not normal. The feeling of dread began prickling underneath my skin. Something was very wrong with this situation. I turned towards the lamp in the living room while continuously shouting for her name, but to no avail. I scoured around downstairs looking for her, but she was not around. The knot in my stomach was pulled even tighter as I took a glance upstairs. That's when I heard something I'll never forget. A familiar voice possessed my inner voice and stabbed icicles into my spine as it said, "It's never a pretty sight." I knew exactly who that voice belonged to. The man from the caravan. I began hyperventilating once more while frantically pacing my head all around me, utterly afraid that the sickly odd man was lurking in my home. I shouted at the top of my lungs for Maria as I ran upstairs towards our bedroom. The higher I ascended, the more I noticed a faint aroma of patchouli, which grew more potent the closer I got to the closed door. I reached my hand onto the doorknob, but violently shot my hand back as I screamed in agonizing pain as I watched the melted skin from my left hand begin to peel. It continued to burn until I vigorously wiped my hand on my jacket. As I did so, I caught a strong whiff of patchouli. Snapping my head towards the doorknob, I noticed a dripping, glistening fluid. I couldn't believe what was happening as I realized what it was: candle wax. I glanced at my aching hand and was shocked to see that it had quickly turned bright red, with tinges of purple as chunks of skin peeled off, producing a wet, sloppy noise as they stuck to the floor in front of me. I jumped a little at what I heard next: the sound of splashing water coming from the other side of the door. Powered by adrenaline rushing through my veins, I got up and gave the door a mighty kick, which snapped the hinges, sending it flying backwards. I ran inside the dark room and towards the bathroom, and that's when I saw her. Maria's head was just barely peeking above the bathtub, and my voice cracked with worry as I called her name while rushing towards her with outstretched arms, yet she remained still and silent. The bathroom was almost completely dark, barely illuminated by the light of 4 candles placed in the corners of the tub, and that is the moment that I was confronted with true horror. I grasped Maria's half-sunken head, raising it up and facing it towards mine. Her throat was slit wide open. I began to whimper and sob as I held the lifeless, cold face of my dear Maria, the love of my life, in my trembling hands. "No, no, no, no," was all I could utter. Maria's body was lying in a tub filled with fresh blood. Not only that, but it was bubbling and steamy, producing a haunting aroma that I could only describe as a mixture of patchouli, burning metal, and overdone rotting steak. I covered my nose and began gagging profusely as tears fell down my face and chunky bile built up in my throat. I had to get her out of there carefully. I grabbed a handful of Maria's hair and dragged her limp body down over the edge of the tub and onto the tile floor. My state widened when I glanced over her body and saw the transparent red wax that had covered her entire body from the lips down. Through the thin coating of wax, hundreds of thick, jagged slashes littered her body, and in her wax-sealed hand protruded a long black chef's knife. I screamed out in inconsolable rage and was ridden with terror. I began slamming my fists onto the bathroom floor as I cried and shouted. My teeth were grinding with such force that I cracked a fragment of one of my canines, and it fell right on Maria's wax-covered lips along with a wet string of spit and blood. The sight of it made me cry more. I felt as if I had desecrated my precious Maria's body. Something odd happened. The spit and blood mixture that fell onto the wax covering began to simmer. I reached my shaky, burned hand down carefully towards her still lips to remove the impurity that I had just laid on her. The slightest touch of my finger into the bloody tooth caused the wax barrier to crumble, and I watched in disgust as wax and the tooth fragment slipped between her parted lips and fell into her throat. My rage and sadness became uncontrollable. I began punching the tile floor, then the tub, and eventually began wailing at my own face as streams of fresh blood began splattering out of me and onto the embalmed corpse of my lover. I didn't understand how any of this was possible. I had just seen her outside, and it didn't make any sense. Endless questions with no answers piled up in my mind, and my sanity was broken. I began hollering for Maria to wake up, pleading that if she woke up, we could have a baby and fix everything if only she'd open her eyes and look at me. I kept repeating, "Just please come back," over and over again on a continuous loop until I once again remembered she had my tooth in her throat. I started shouting only inches from her face, "Please wake up, you have a tooth in your throat. Let me get it out. I need to get it out." I went on for who knows how long, lamenting and producing more tears than I thought possible, all while shaking Maria's head aggressively in the hope that it would spark her back to life, of course to no avail. After some time, or maybe a lot of time, I decided I needed to get the tooth out because I thought she deserved better than that. I banged my blood-stained and battered face onto the floor as hard as I could to punish myself for being so careless, then swiftly stuck my entire hand down Maria's throat to find the tooth. Her wet, warm tongue and slimy gums pressed against my hand as I felt around the deep recesses of her mouth and throat. I was more than a wrist deep when I felt the tooth, but I also felt something else. I tried my hardest to expand my fingers enough to get a solid grip on the tooth, but I was growing frustrated by my inability to get a proper grip on it, and due to my frustration and shaky hands, I ended up pushing the tooth farther down her throat and could no longer feel it. Momentarily, I clenched my fist out of anger, but I could still feel something else lodged in her mouth. It felt like a firm yet delicately thick string brushing against my fist. Twisting my fingers carefully along the deep fleshy walls of her mouth, I managed to get a grip on it and pull it out slightly until about 3 inches of it rose out of her mouth into the dim flickering light. I immediately knew what it was and became absolutely convinced that Maria had not committed suicide or suffered a tragic, unknowable accident. Rather, I was convinced that my dear Maria had been murdered, mutilated, and had been dead for hours. This realization contradicted the experience I had just had outside with her and sent my mind and sanity spiraling. The only answer I knew for certain was that she had somehow been murdered by the man from the candle caravan. The black, brittle, string-like object that rose out of my girlfriend's mouth was a giant wick. All I could do when I saw it was stare in horror as my body trembled and piss leaked out of my pants, adding to the horrific smell permeating throughout the bathroom. I had never felt so many chaotic sensations course through me at once, and eventually I became caught in a paralyzing stasis from being overwhelmed by true raw fear. I don't know how much time had passed just blankly staring at the gruesome sight before me when the memory of Maria crying outside and apologizing played vividly in my mind. Despite my frozen state, I softly asked my dead girlfriend, "What are you sorry for?" Tears began to swell as I continued, "It should be me who's sorry. It should have been me inside of that tub. It should have been me." As soon as I finished uttering those words, my vision snapped from outward to inward as I saw a white candle come to life in my mind's eye, and in the light I saw the oily face of the odd man. He was looking straight into my soul with those fierce silver eyes, enlarged by the purple protruding veins around them, that seemed to pulse and throb like a heartbeat, yet his face was no longer ancient-looking. He looked significantly younger. Despite his eyes, his skin radiated an ethereal glow, just like Maria's had outside. His expression was neutral and impossible to read, and we stared at one another until he spoke slowly. "Do you see that lit red candle in the far left corner? Grab it and look at the bottom." Somehow, I could see the man in my mind's eye, yet also see the red candle in front of me, as if I were stuck in 2 different realities. I didn't consciously decide to follow his command, yet my body obeyed his words as if I were being controlled. My injured hand reached towards the candle, and as I did, I was struck by confusion. There was a sigil branded into the palm of my hand, which I had not noticed all this time. It was of a circle with lines that pointed outward like the directions you'd see on a compass, and in the middle of each of those lines was another line forming the shape of a cross. I picked up the big candle, turned it over, and nearly dropped it to the floor when I saw what was engraved on the bottom. The antidote for adultery. The expression on the man's face changed, and to my surprise, he began to cry, and as he did, it looked as if his tears had caused his face to slightly melt. I watched until he spoke again. I gave her that candle this morning after I witnessed an unforgivable act. She was well acquainted with a man in an alley next to a bookstore in town. I did what was necessary. I know that pain. I felt like I had just been stabbed in the gut as tears fell down my face, but only because I actually believed him. Something in me knew he was telling the truth. Tears began swelling once more as I recalled the bookstore and the man whom Maria had been with one day when I was picking her up from there. She was in that alley right next to the shop, and I watched as she hugged a man rather intimately until she looked over towards my truck and immediately let go and made her way towards it. I remember addressing it to Maria, and at that time she had said that the guy had given her amazing advice that she really needed and that she only hugged him to thank him. We argued for a few minutes afterward, but she ended up convincing me that I could trust her, and I gave in. But now I knew that my trust had been displaced. My gaze refocused on the corpse on the floor. Only this time, my eyes briefly narrowed in with judgment and malice, only to widen again as I let out a giggle and a wide smile. Grabbing a handful of hair from that cheater's head, I pulled her face towards mine until our noses touched and began to laugh even louder as I mentally degraded and mocked her, then gargled up some fresh, thick phlegm and spit it across her face, then smeared it all over. I dragged the body aggressively back into the tub and bashed its filthy head into the hard marble surface, hearing a loud cracking sound as some teeth fell out of its mouth. I began to laugh again while the odd man in my mind's eye synchronized with my laughter, forming a horrifying, distorted symphony until we stopped simultaneously. With humor and joy still emanating from his face, he said, "Simon now, lad, it's more of a treat when they're alive. Take it easy." I don't know why, but the reality of the situation hit me, and I started freaking out. I exclaimed, "How would I explain this? How could I get out of this? It looks like I had done it. For God's sake, my tooth was in her throat, and the police will surely suspect me. What the hell am I supposed to do?" To my terror, the man's face changed instantly from lightheartedness to stern anger. His silver eyes darkened, and I felt a burning sensation spread rapidly across the entirety of my body. I screeched in pain as I collapsed to the floor, frantically kicking and digging my nails into my damaged face. It had felt like I was cooking from the inside out until it suddenly stopped. The odd man's eyes returned to their normal silver color, and he gently said, "I told you to take it easy. You need not worry. I've taken care of all the provisions. You must simply ignite the wick, and her presence will live on forever, like she never left." I clumsily lifted myself up against the wall, while trying to wrap my mind around what he had said. What the hell did he mean by that? As if reading my thoughts, he said, "Ignite the wick and place the symbol on your hand on her head, and she will come back to you and remain loyal for eternity." I was shocked by the implications of his words, looking back at Maria for a few long moments until I heard a clank on the floor next to me. My white lighter had dropped out of my jacket pocket. I picked it up and crawled closer to the side of the tub, ignited it, then put it towards the wick as I placed the symbol branded on my hand on her forehead. The entire wick caught fire upon contact and produced a loud crackling noise like you'd hear from a firework. I backed up instinctively and ended up falling onto the floor once more. The man laughed at me mockingly and then said, "You're welcome, lad. Watch the magic of creation, the birth of eternal loyalty." I got back up and watched as the symbol from my hand began to engrave itself from underneath Maria's skin and spread itself from her forehead to the entirety of her visible body. Her mouth was engulfed in flames. I could smell her melting gums as they cracked and popped like hot grease. They smelled like rotting chicken liver coated in insecticide. I covered my nose and tried my hardest to keep my eyes open as I watched the flames spread throughout the entirety of her face and singe her hair, only adding to the horrid scent as the fire spread across the entirety of her body. The wax and blood mixture in the tub began to swirl and boil intensely, forming unnatural geometric patterns. It was faint, but I could hear the faint whispers and barely audible screams of Maria masked behind the bubbling and popping of melting organs. The foul odor was becoming unbearable. My eyes were burning, and it made me run out of the bathroom, gagging and attempting to breathe fresh air. I heard the bathroom door slam shut behind me as I dropped to my knees in the bedroom, coughing profusely. When I tried to get back up and watch what was unfolding, I was forced back down by an excruciating and burning sensation that I could only describe as maggots covered in lava crawling underneath the skin of my entire body. I tried to scream, straining my throat and voice beyond their capacity, but no sound filled the air except for the faint clicking of the bugs crawling within me. It felt like days of enduring severe punishment, straight out of oblivion, until it all stopped in an instant, and I once again heard the voice of the man say, "The worst part is over. You don't need to witness anything more until our creation is complete." Next thing I knew, my body went limp, and a wave of drowsiness crashed over me as my eyes flickered until eventually shutting completely. I could have sworn right before going unconscious I heard him say one last thing. "The gift of eternal loyalty comes with the cost of it. You belong to me." That was the last time I heard or saw the Candleman face to face. I woke up to the smell of cinnamon and soft bed sheets against my face as my eyes opened, watching smoke swirl in the shining light peering through the window beside my bed. Groggy and confused, I moved my eyes towards the grooves in the ceiling until that vague memory of slamming Maria's head into the bathtub replayed through my mind. My grogginess faded immediately, and I felt the blood rush through my body as I felt fingers dance softly on my lips, tasting faintly of vanilla. I shot out of bed and stared in amazement at Maria, laying in bed like a Playboy model, seductively smiling at me, intentionally batting her eyes gently. I wanted to say something, yet shock overtook my anxious brain and left me blank as my body became possessed by intense uneasiness. I felt my legs shaking and going limp under me. I had no idea if I had dreamt everything that had occurred the night before or if a miracle appeared before my eyes. She must have recognized my discomfort, because next she stood up slowly and walked towards me with a serious gaze that was both unrecognizable and familiar, not once averting her eyes from mine. I had never seen Maria make that face before. Just the sight of it brought on a minor headache. I backed away from her, bewildered at how any of this was possible. She stood right in front of me, then stepped onto my feet while looking up at me. She reached down slowly and grabbed my previously burned hand, which was still slightly damaged, confirming to me that everything I had experienced was indeed a reality. We both stared at my palm, which was somehow mostly healed, and out of nowhere, the sigil itched itself into my hand once more, causing me to grit my teeth and try to pull away. But before I could, Maria had gripped onto me tighter with the strength of a horse rearing up and stomping onto me. She swiftly leaned in, pressing her lips to the edge of my ear, then quietly whispered, "You need not fear me as long as you obey him. I am yours, and you are his. Loyalty is not a request, but a command. I obey you, you obey him, and in the end we are all satisfied." She gave a little giggle, and then kissed my cheek, which gave off a faint aroma of pomegranate and sent a subtle wave throughout my entire body, then proceeded to say, "I still want a child, you know." She stepped back with a warm smile that seemed more familiar now, and then walked out of the room, and I heard her make her way downstairs. I plopped myself onto the edge of the bed, replaying her words over and over, doing my best to make sense of them, until I ultimately came to the conclusion that this entire situation could have gone a lot worse. I mean, I could have been charged with a murder I didn't commit. My future could have been to rot in a prison cell, but here I was with a miracle before my eyes. My girlfriends were alive. She smelled so good, and was conversing with me without screaming or rolling her eyes. She said she belonged to me. That thought turned my confused expression into a wide grin. I could smell sausage and pancake batter downstairs, and my happiness turned to ecstasy. I thought, wow, she's cooking breakfast. It's been ages since she's done this. I could get used to this. Everything's going to be okay. This is normal. This is normal. She shouted playfully from downstairs, calling me down for breakfast. Her voice was hypnotic and enticing. I felt my body move towards the kitchen before I even decided to move. I got downstairs and saw Maria putting the last of the ground-up sausage on my plate as I approached her and kissed her on the cheek. We sat in comfortable silence, eating our delicious meal. It was perfect, and the sausage was unlike anything I've ever tasted before. I was about to ask Maria what brand it was when I was interrupted by a thought that invaded my mind. I heard a distorted woman's voice in my head say, "Get in the car now and drive away." The tone of it threw me off. Maria must have noticed my expression because she told me to obey his command with that same unfamiliar and contorted commanding face. The air around me suddenly became hot, and I swear I could see a flicker of light behind her eyes swirling around. The smell of fresh breakfast was replaced with the scent of burning sage and char, making me scrunch my nose. I know what she meant, but the voice I heard didn't belong to the man. Regardless, I got up immediately and did my best to appear calm as I grabbed my keys and got the hell out of there without taking another look at that horrid face. I kept repeating over and over again, "What the hell was that? What the hell was that?" I wondered as I drove down random roads. I wasn't receiving any directions, but something within me knew where to go. As I watched my hands become clammy and my stomach start growling and beginning to ache, I knew exactly where we were going now. I was being controlled by something that was leading me back down that back road into the forest that I never wanted to visit again. My anxiety turned to genuine fear, which made my limbs turn heavy, and my thoughts became corrupted with images of all sorts of possibilities for what or whom was awaiting me. As we drew nearer, the sight of the towering forest seemed to suffocate me, and I found myself antsy and unable to stop the car, even though my mind was screaming for me to get out of there immediately. I was totally helpless, a victim of my own flesh. The culmination of all these triggering sensations and chaotic thoughts caused me to screech at the top of my lungs, and I felt my hand shoot up toward the radio, turning it on, and then instantly, the sound of the news anchors' voices replicated those of angels. I was at peace hearing them, even though I wasn't paying attention to what they were saying at first. I just needed something to block out all the noise. I breathed in slowly and started laughing as I heard a joke the two news anchors were making about dogs dressed in cute Christmas apparel slipping while trying to run on wooden floors. I laughed hard as I imagined a variety of dogs in ugly Christmas sweaters sliding around on the floor. I desperately needed that laugh. I refocused on the environment around me when I heard a strong whistling wind and noticed the giant trees begin to sway violently above. As I peered through the thin crack in between the trees, I noticed a monstrous storm cloud lurking in my direction. I knew this wouldn't be good. If I continued driving under the branches, my truck would inevitably be damaged or crushed altogether by the debris of falling branches. I had to get my truck somewhere safe, and as soon as that thought appeared, I felt my hand jerk the wheel to the right towards a small space in between the trees, barely large enough to get a clear view of the darkening sky above. My foot pressed down on the brake without my consent, and it made a sudden, jerking stop. I heard the radio's volume rise. Glitchy, distorted voices masked by white noise rang throughout the inside of the car until I willfully turned the knob slightly, and with full clarity, I heard one of the news anchors say the following. Breaking news, here in Minneapolis. A local bookstore owner was discovered brutally murdered within his personal office within the bookstore premises by a work colleague. Authorities have identified the victim as Jason Grimm. Authorities have also stated that the victim was found around 9:00 a.m. this morning sprawled out on the floor with hundreds of slashes across his body and nearly drained of all his blood. The authorities and forensics department were baffled by another horrifying discovery. The victim of this terrifying act of murder was found missing large chunks of flesh along with numerous vital organs. The family of Jason Grimm is in complete shock. I wailed at the radio continuously until I heard the voices fade out, then began projectile vomiting all over the dashboard and onto my lap. As I did so, the memory of Maria making sausage replayed throughout my mind. Only this time her face was staring dead at me with a horrifying grin. I knew immediately what I had eaten and began crying and screaming uncontrollably until more vomit shot out of me. My muscles were clenched and clammy as I began hopping and shifting frantically in my seat. I couldn't think straight, but I knew how damned I truly was. The horrifying reality was starting to set in, and the thought of prison or death itself seemed more comforting than the hell I was currently experiencing. My conscious awareness was shifting from first person to third person back and forth. I could see the entire unnerving and disgusting scene play out from multiple angles, as if I were in the back seat and the passenger seat beside me. Streams of tears kept leaking out as I hunched down into a ball and gripped my head with my wet vomit-covered hands as I shook in my seat for what felt like an eternity. As I looked down at the floor, I saw the shades of light shining in quickly vanish, becoming replaced by an unnatural darkness. The wind grew mightier, not like a howl, but rather like a ferocious roar echoing throughout the forest as branches began slamming to the ground around the truck. I became so hyper-aware of my surroundings, yet somehow another fragment of my consciousness was disassociating. Shivering relentlessly and unable to control my motor functions, I stared blankly at the puke on the dashboard, feeling myself drift away, until I noticed a shining figure slightly move in the tree line in the blur of my vision. I focused in and saw a woman in the distance, about 30 yards away. She had black hair covering most of her face, and she was wearing a white dress. I could tell she was staring directly at me. My red eyes widened as I realized who it was. It was Maria. I blinked my eyes, and in an instant, she had disappeared. I rubbed my eyes frantically, nearly getting puke in them, and shot a glance back at where the familiar figure was standing, yet saw nothing but the swaying trees. But then I felt a wet and bitterly cold touch on my cheek. I screeched and shot back towards the door, and I looked beside me to see Maria. She was sitting beside me, looking into my eyes with sorrow. The sound of the wind seemed to go silent as she looked at me. She was practically glowing amidst the dark atmosphere, and the closer I looked, the more I noticed that her skin was slightly transparent. I was too confused to speak. I could only stare, but somehow I felt safe and calm. Something in me told me that what I was seeing was pure. I knew what I was witnessing. It was abnormal, but the best kind of abnormal that I had experienced recently. I examined her carefully and noticed the green candle I had intended to give her placed in her lap, amazed that it had been forgotten about. She looked down at the luminous candle in her lap, then back at me. She slowly leaned in and whispered, "I'm sorry. I felt the love you've had for me like I never could have before, but it's all over now. I'm sorry that I can't fix my mistakes. I can only help you with yours. Never go back. I am what you're seeking, and I will always protect you, but you will never see me again." She pulled away from me with a weak smile, and in her hand was my white lighter. She looked up at me again with that faint, beautiful smile, and the next thing I knew, my body was sent soaring through the air and into the forest, until my body smacked into a hard surface, and my senses shut off completely. I slept without a nightmare or otherworldly visions. I was pure awareness in a black void of silence. When my eyes opened, I was surprised to wake up on Earth, temporarily forgetting what being alive meant. The sound of birds chirping and leaves swaying must have woken me up. Looking down, I saw piles of white maggots piling up to feed on the vomit smeared across my soaking wet clothing and across my cut-up skin. When I reached to swipe them off, my ribs and arms protested by sending waves of aching pain that seemed to stab into my bones. I could still move them and managed to get the disgusting little worm-like creatures off of me, so I was at least pleased that I hadn't broken a bone. When I tried moving my legs, I was even more surprised that I could wiggle them without so much as an ache. I stood up a little wobbly and gazed around. When I turned my head backwards, I noticed my body had slammed into a thick oak tree. I couldn't believe I was even alive, or had the ability to stand after colliding with it. It was truly a miracle. I shot my glance back and noticed my truck, or what was left of it anyway, as a heaping mess of scorched and jagged car parts, along with broken fragments of black stained glass, littered the dirt road. It looked like a bomb had gone off. I was utterly confused as to how such a thing could have happened. Mary wasn't in sight. There was nothing suspicious at all, only stupid auto parts. I dug through the wreckage tediously, trying to find a hidden letter or some sort of answer, but there was nothing to be found. Eventually, I gave up and wandered ever so slowly out of that forest and far away from my home. I had this intuitive knowing, along with Mary's advice, that I should never step foot in that house or in that town ever again, and I listened. Hours passed of walking along the empty back roads, battling excruciating pain and using every bit of my willpower to keep marching forward, when I finally came across a truck stop diner right when darkness began to permeate the sky. This is where I am now, sitting alone and damaged, while sipping crappy coffee while I write this. I have only a few dollars in my wallet, no cell phone, and no vehicle. I don't know what I'm going to do or where I'm going to go next, but I'm sure I'll figure something out. At least I hope so. There aren't many customers in here. A few have given me odd glances due to my disheveled appearance, but one of the waitresses here has kept staring at me over and over again, and she doesn't even try to hide it. She's walked by me a few times, and each time she does, she smells different. It reminds me of Maria. I think I need to get out of here. I just watched her gift a small blue candle to a trucker who walked in, and after she did so, she looked straight at me with a menacing smile that sent chills throughout my body, and I swear I saw her eyes shift from a light green to silver. If you ever come across a caravan or an old man selling candles, get the hell out of there. If someone ever gives you a candle, smash it on the ground or refuse it outright and never light it. If someone smells like a variety of different candle scents, never speak to them and leave immediately. I still don't know what I'm going to do about the old man, and I don't think there's anything I can do until he takes control over what belongs to him. My mother died suddenly and unexpectedly sometime in the early hours of Sunday morning. The coroner said she suffered a massive stroke, and her death would have been instantaneous. This brought me some small comfort, knowing that she hadn't suffered in the end. I was the one who found her. I arrived at her tidy, semi-detached suburban house at Sunday lunchtime, bringing with me her food shopping for the coming week. I feared the worst when she didn't answer the door after repeated knocks and ringing. It was with great trepidation that I used my spare key and marched through the hallway, shouting my mother's name in a panic as I frantically searched, hoping for the best but expecting the worst outcome. I found her lying down on the sofa, her eyes shut. Mom looked peaceful, like she'd simply fallen asleep. For a fleeting second, I believed this might be the case, but when I touched her skin, it was ice cold. It didn't take me long to realize she had no pulse and wasn't breathing. Finding my mother's lifeless body was obviously a very traumatic experience. However, at the time, I felt oddly calm as I went through the ritual of calling an ambulance, waiting for the paramedics to arrive and tell me what I already knew. My father had died 1 year before, having lost a long battle against cancer. My parents had been married for 36 years, and Mom dedicated herself to caring for her husband after his diagnosis. When he died, the largest part of her died with him. She was overcome with grief, barely able to function, and had little interest in life. I asked her to move in with us, thinking it would do her good to be around family. But she steadfastly refused to leave the home she'd shared with her husband for 3 decades. Instead, we compromised. I went to see her each and every day, doing her shopping and making sure she was eating, washing, and looking after herself. I always hoped she would bounce back, but deep down, I realized it was only a matter of time. Mom's death certificate said she succumbed to a stroke, but I knew she died of a broken heart. It's tough losing your parents, even when, like me, you're an adult with a family of your own. I'm married and have 2 children, so I'm very blessed, but I still miss my mom and dad every day. Lots of people will be able to relate to my loss, but this isn't why I'm writing this story. What I'm here to talk about is the 40-year-old diary I found in my mother's attic. I never met my uncle. My mother's brother died a few years before I was born. Mom spoke fondly of her older brother and how he'd looked out for her when they were little. She didn't like talking about his death, only saying he was a policeman killed in the line of duty. We took this to mean he served in the Royal Ulster Constabulary and was probably killed during the Troubles, the ethno-religious conflict that plagued our home country of Northern Ireland for nearly 30 years. Mom got upset every time the topic was brought up, and so she rarely talked about my uncle's police career when I was growing up. My sister and I had taken on the emotionally draining task of clearing out my parents' house after Mom died. We found this quite difficult, as just about every photograph, ornament, and knick-knack had some sort of sentimental value or memory attached to it. We shed more than a few tears during those days of work, and I found it upsetting to be in the house where I discovered Mom's dead body. But we supported each other and persevered. I found the dust-covered old box in the back of the attic, buried under years' worth of memorabilia and assorted junk. It contained what little remained of my late uncle's possessions, mostly related to his service with the RUC. Inside I found his neatly folded uniform and peaked cap, both in miraculously good condition given their age. Thankfully, the moths hadn't gotten at the material. Other than this, there were a few old black and white photographs of my uncle on his graduation day from the police training college. There he was, looking smart and handsome in his dress uniform, standing to attention while smiling for the camera. He looked very impressive. I guessed my uncle was slightly younger than me when these photos were taken, but I could definitely see the family resemblance. I dug deeper into the box of forgotten memories, finding a number of dog-eared and faded papers relating to his service and postings. And there was something else, a small leather-bound notebook. I flicked through the first few pages and was taken aback to discover it was my uncle's diary, recording his service as a cop on the front lines of West Belfast during the 1970s, some of the worst years of the Troubles. I informed my sister of my discovery, but she wasn't overly interested, and so I inherited my late uncle's possessions, including his diary. I took the notebook home, intending to study the journal entries in detail. I believed the diary would be of historical interest and provide an insight into an uncle I'd never met. I hoped it would serve as a link to the past, a connection to my family that would otherwise be lost after my mother's death. However, I became increasingly disturbed the more I read. My uncle clearly had a very difficult job. As a CID detective, he was tasked with investigating some of the most brutal sectarian murders of the period, while at the same time being a target for the paramilitaries. His entries demonstrated he was working under tremendous mental strain. I trained as a counselor and would conclude from his writings that my uncle suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. His detailed and visceral descriptions of murder scenes and atrocities make for difficult reading. But there are elements of his story that I cannot explain, incidents and occurrences beyond rational understanding. For this reason, I have decided to transcribe and post my uncle's diary entries in the hope that someone with more insight than me may be able to shed some light on the bizarre and disturbing events described by my late uncle. And so, here it is. I've never kept a diary before. Never had any inclination to. The truth is, I'm not much of a writer. Essays and police reports, usually that's my lot. That's not to say I'm uneducated. I was the first in my family to go to university, an achievement my parents were proud of. I grew up in a Protestant working-class community in East Belfast. Our family wasn't wealthy, but we weren't poor either. My father worked all his life as a welder in the shipyards, as his father had done before him. It was expected that I would follow in their footsteps, but I surprised everyone by excelling in my education, gaining a place in a prestigious grammar school before going to Queen's University to study for my law degree. By the time I graduated, my homeland was in turmoil. Civil rights protests had turned violent, with rioting on the streets. The army was deployed to keep the peace, but the violence escalated, resulting in hundreds of deaths during the early years of the decade. Bombings and shootings were an everyday occurrence, and my home city was being torn apart in front of my very eyes. This made my decision about my career path easier. I hated what the terrorists were doing to my country and wanted to play my part in ending the violence. And so, the RUC was the obvious choice. To be fair, my motives weren't entirely altruistic. Northern Ireland's police force was being rapidly expanded due to the security situation, and so, thanks to my university degree, I was able to apply for a fast track into the CID, with the prospect of further promotions to follow. I finished my training during the summer of 1973, graduating from the police college with my parents and little sister in attendance. A proud day, but soon I was thrown in at the deep end with my first posting in Goverix. I've seen some terrible things over the last 3 years. The aftermath of bombings, human bodies torn to shreds by bullets and shrapnel, and colleagues gunned down while carrying out their duties. These atrocities had an impact on me, but I got through my first posting. But in a case of out of the firing pan and into the fire, I got redeployed to the CID section in West Belfast. In recent months, my life has spiraled out of control as the stresses of the job have taken their toll. My girlfriend left me a couple of weeks ago because she could no longer deal with my erratic behavior and violent outbursts. I can't really blame her. I hardly speak with my family and friends anymore. My job has become all-encompassing, and I have little time for anything else. When I'm not working, I drink heavily, trying to drown my sorrows and forget the horrific things I've seen out on the streets. It doesn't really help, but I can't stop. As 1976 draws to a close, I'm working on 2 major investigations. One is against a skilled and ruthless provisional IRA bombmaker, codenamed Nemesis. This dangerous individual has been responsible for dozens of attacks against the security forces and commercial businesses in the city center. We've come close to capturing Nemesis, but the bastard keeps slipping through our fingers. I have no doubt that he'll keep bombing until we either capture or kill him. The second investigation relates to a loyalist murder gang led by a terrorist known as the Butcher. This gang specializes in kidnapping Catholic men and brutally torturing their victims before slitting their throats. The sheer brutality of this gang has shocked and terrified the population, even though this city has long become hardened to violence and death. Blood is running through the streets of Belfast, and we're barely able to hold the line. I was raised in the Protestant faith and was made to go to Sunday school when I was younger. Nevertheless, I've never been particularly religious. I'm not a superstitious man, but some of what I've witnessed over the last few months defies any logical explanation. I honestly don't know whether I'm going mad, but I've become increasingly convinced that the bloodshed has unleashed something truly evil onto the war-torn streets of Belfast, a shadowy entity that stalks me and haunts my dreams. For this reason, I decided to keep this journal and record what I see and hear in the hope that one day somebody will be able to make some sense of it all. With God as my witness, for the first time in my life, I am truly scared. The Butcher has struck again. A housewife discovered the body dumped in a back alley off Agnes Street. At first, she assumed the corpse was a discarded mannequin doll, as the wounds were so severe. The victim's injuries were consistent with the previous murders. The man is still to be identified, but we've determined he's in his early 20s. There were multiple stab wounds and deep cuts across his hands, arms, and torso, none of which would have proved fatal. The cause of death was the man's throat being slit, cut so deep that the bone was exposed. The torture and killing evidently occurred at a different location, with the body being dumped here by the murder gang. We'll trace the victim's identity over the next day or two after we trawl through the missing persons lists. The family will be notified, and the press will need to be updated. Doubtless, there will be more sensationalist headlines in the tabloid papers. This is the third murder by the butcher gang in the last 6 months. All the victims have been young Catholic males kidnapped at random from the streets. Undoubtedly, there will be a statement released by some anonymous paramilitary spokesman, a generic claim that the victim confessed under interrogation to membership in the IRA and had been executed for crimes against the people of Ulster. Our investigation is focused on 3 loyalist terror cells operating in the Shankill area. I have strong suspicions as to the butcher's identity, but so far we have no evidence. The gang has been good at covering their tracks, and witnesses are in short supply. We spent most of the day at the crime scene, freezing on a gray, drizzly afternoon. The army set up a security cordon, as was our standard procedure. A number of locals gathered around the cordon, the usual combination of nosy neighbors and ghoulish voyeurs hoping for a glance at the body. A few journalists showed up during the course of the afternoon, snapping photos and taking notes. They asked for a statement, but we weren't willing to give them any information at this early stage. Night had fallen by the time we moved the corpse, shifting his remains into a body bag and putting the poor fellow into the back of a waiting ambulance. By now, most of the crowd had moved on. They'd seen it all before, after all. I scanned the cordon as my colleagues moved the body, spotting one solitary figure lingering on the far side of the street, lurking in the shadows and glaring in my direction. The stranger was clad all in black, with a hood covering his head. I couldn't see his face or make out any of his features. I'm not a man who scares easily, but the sight of this mysterious figure brought a chill down my spine. He looked like a man out of his time, a throwback to a previous age. Nevertheless, despite his odd appearance, there was something strangely familiar about this interloper, and I felt sure I'd seen him before, although where and when I cannot recall. I stared at this individual for the better part of 2 minutes, trying to get a sense of him. He didn't move an inch the whole time, standing perfectly still and seemingly not reacting to anything occurring around him. Even though I could not see his eyes, I could nevertheless feel his harsh glare burning through me. My first instinct was to turn and flee, but as a policeman, I needed to show strength. This individual hadn't technically committed an offense, but security legislation gave me the right to detain and question him. I decided to do so, but before I could make my move, I got temporarily distracted by one of my colleagues asking me a question. When I turned back, the dark figure had gone, apparently disappearing without a trace. I asked the Army lieutenant in command of the security cordon about the mysterious man, but the officer could not recall seeing him, nor could any of his men. The whole incident left me feeling shaken and confused. Had I imagined this figure? I don't believe so. I have an unnerving feeling that I've seen this stranger before somewhere, perhaps more than once, but always lurking in the shadows, somewhere on the periphery. I fear I'm being stalked. Perhaps the IRA or some other paramilitary group is targeting me, gathering intelligence for a possible hit. I've therefore decided to become more vigilant regarding my personal security. Hopefully I'm overreacting, but you can't be too careful these days. I've been receiving threatening phone calls to my home line for 3 nights in a row now, all during the early hours. The first night, it was little more than heavy breathing and low groans, making me think it was just a sex pest. I told the caller to go to hell and hung up the phone. The next night I could hear low whispers down the line, so soft I couldn't make out a single word. By the third night, I could make out words, but they were spoken in a language I could not understand. The male voice at the other end of the line has a detached, almost inhuman quality to it. I've been unable to make out any accents or speech patterns that could help identify the caller. I've developed this unsettling feeling that I'm being watched, and these late-night calls seem to confirm a pattern of intimidation. Tomorrow I will make a report to the duty officer, and I plan to sleep with my service revolver close to hand from now on. I was called to the scene of a bombing this morning. An army patrol was hit on the lower falls by a small but deadly device hidden inside a beer keg, detonated by a hidden command wire. 4 soldiers were injured in the blast, but the man closest to the bomb took the brunt of it, losing both legs and also suffering severe chest wounds. He was still alive when we arrived at the scene. His body had been reduced to a bloody mess, and his eyes were mad with shock and pain as he screamed out and grasped for the bloody stumps that were once his legs. They rushed him to the hospital in a Saracen APC, but he died from massive blood loss before they got there. I later learned that the dead soldier was only 19 years old. We evacuated the wounded and secured the scene. What remained of the device was removed for further forensic investigation, although the design and MO all pointed to the bomb maker we were pursuing, an IRA operative codenamed Nemesis. His devices are becoming increasingly lethal as he plies his deadly trade. We didn't have long to examine the scene. A crowd soon gathered on the edge of the security cordon, including a number of young men who jeered and mocked the wounded men. The soldiers manning the blockade were from the same company as the dead private, and understandably, they were upset and angry. A few soldiers reacted to the provocation, moving into the crowd while swinging their batons and attempting in vain to make arrests. Soon, more local youths arrived on the scene carrying half-bricks and glass bottles, which they flung at the line of soldiers. Within minutes, the situation had descended into a full-scale riot. As the violence escalated, the army officer in command on the ground told us he could no longer guarantee our safety, as intelligence suggested the IRA may use the riot as a cover to launch a gun attack upon our personnel. Therefore, we had little choice but to evacuate the scene, knowing all too well that potential forensic evidence would be destroyed in the rioting. I was being shoved into the back of an APC when I saw him out of the corner of my eye. The dark figure was the same mysterious man I'd seen that night in November on Agnes Street. It was broad daylight this time, so I got a better look at him. Not that I could see much, as his head was covered by a dark hood and his face by some sort of mask. He blatantly stood in the middle of the street as all hell broke out around him, with rioters throwing missiles and soldiers firing rubber bullets. The chaos seemed to have no effect on the interloper, as he showed no fear of being shot or struck. I honestly couldn't tell whether he was directing the riot or was oblivious to it. However, once again, he appeared to be looking straight at me, as if he'd come to this violent place specifically to confront me. But I only cast my eyes on the hooded man for a brief moment before an army NKO physically dragged me into the back of the vehicle, slamming the steel door shut behind me. This time, I'm certain that the dark figure wasn't a figment of my imagination. He is real, and is deliberately turning up at crime scenes where he knows I'll be posted, stalking me through these war-torn streets. I need to get this bastard before he gets me. The late-night phone calls have become less frequent but more sinister in their tone. Last night he spoke in understandable English for the first time, speaking just 3 terrifying words in a low, croaking voice. I see you. I'm now convinced there is a direct link between the shadowy figure and the threatening calls. I must remain vigilant. I didn't sleep at all last night, but instead drank until dawn with my Webley service revolver by my side. These images keep running through my head. The butchered victim, the screaming soldier without his legs, and always the dark figure watching and taunting me. Honestly, I don't know how much more of this I can take. My boss saw the state of me when I turned up for roll call and sent me straight home. I've been ordered to rest up for a week before returning to duty. I told my commander about the calls and the stalker. He says he'll look into it, but I got the distinct impression he thinks I'm mad. Perhaps he's right. I've been under extreme stress and haven't been sleeping. Hopefully, the rest will do me good. I'm still off duty, but I got a call from one of my colleagues. The chief suspect in the butcher gang has been arrested on a weapon charge. With a successful conviction, he'll get at least 5 years. It's not what we hoped for. The bastard should be charged with murder, but at least he'll be off the streets. The news has boosted my spirits somewhat, but the violence continues across the city. Yesterday, there were a series of bombings across the town center, and no doubt Nemesis played his role. The streets are awash with blood, and terror stalks the streets. What can one man do against such unrelenting hatred? Last night was my first shift back on duty following my leave of absence. My boss has taken me off the murder investigation. I objected, but not too hard. I got put on night duty with a squad of uniformed officers. This was meant to be an easy job to get me back into the swing of things, but it didn't turn out that way. It was a freezing cold night, and me and the boys were warming ourselves up with hot mugs of tea when the call came in. A disturbance was reported on a back street off Antrim Road in the north of the city. Local residents had reported strange activity and raised voices emanating from inside an abandoned Victorian mill at the end of their street. We went out in strength, 8 heavily armed officers traveling in 2 armored Land Rovers as we sped through the dark city streets. The area was mixed religion, but known for IRA activity, and so we were understandably cautious, as we feared a potential setup and ambush. Our suspicions were heightened when we reached the scene and discovered the street abandoned and eerily quiet. Proceeding with caution, the sergeant in command ordered 2 officers to set up a cordon at the end of the street, while the rest of us proceeded with guns drawn. The road was typical of those throughout the working-class districts of Belfast, with rows of red brick terraced houses and old 2-ups and 2-downs dating back to the Victorian era. The mill sat at the far end of the street, its dark structure casting an ominous shadow over the small houses beneath it. At one time, the mill would have provided employment to the men and women in this area, but it had long since closed like so many others, resulting in high unemployment in communities such as this. The abandoned industrial building had a sinister appearance, reminding me of a grim citadel from some kind of dark fairy tale. We had no idea what to expect. I hoped we were dealing with minor vandalism caused by bored teenagers, but something didn't seem right about the whole situation. There was a terrible tension in the air. We all felt it. Once again, I had the feeling that I was being watched. I carefully scanned up and down the road, but it was too dark to see anything. My fear was back, worse than ever. I worried then that I'd come back to duty too early. My head was still a mess, and my paranoia was taking over. But there was nothing I could do in that moment except march forward. Suddenly, the street was no longer silent. We heard a faint noise emanating from the supposedly abandoned mill, growing gradually louder the closer we came. It took me a moment to comprehend what I was hearing. There were multiple voices chanting in unison, singing deeply in a language that clearly wasn't English. I thought I recognized a few words in Latin but couldn't be sure. This was a bizarre occurrence, and the last thing any of us had expected to encounter on this night. There was something very sinister about the strange chanting. It felt out of place and time, yet oddly familiar. I could tell the other officers were as uneasy as I was. No doubt we all wanted to turn around and run for the hills, but we're professionals and had a job to do. The unsettling chanting continued, growing louder and faster until it reached a crescendo before it suddenly stopped. And then we heard the scream, blood-curdling as it cut through the cold night air, chilling me to my very bones. "Move! Move! Move!" our sergeant cried out, as he surely realized someone was in trouble. We began to sprint along the cobblestones, making for the sealed front entrance of the mill, clutching our weapons close, ready for action. The Sarge reached the door first, smashing it open with his heavy boot. He barged inside, and we all followed. I feared what we would discover inside, but what we found was beyond my wildest imagination. The interior of the derelict building was largely shrouded in darkness, with the only light coming from lit candles and torches on the floor and hanging from the walls. In the center of the empty space was a circle drawn in the middle of the floor and surrounded by candles. The Sarge used a handheld battery-powered torch to illuminate the scene. To my horror, I realized the circle was in fact a pentagram, and at its very center lay a slaughtered animal, a goat, by the look of it. The creature's throat had been cut, and its stomach sliced open, exposing its intestines and internal organs. The place smelled like an abattoir, and the ground was covered in blood. It took me a second to comprehend what I was seeing here. The satanic symbol and slaughtered animal. It was some sort of sacrifice. How could this be possible? The surgeon nervously raised his torch and shone the light upwards to reveal a half-dozen figures dressed in black robes and hooded masks. Each one stood perfectly still, glaring with menace in our direction. All were armed with daggers stained with the blood of the slaughtered goat. The Sarge screamed at them to drop their weapons and surrender. We covered them with our guns as we waited to see whether they would comply. I clutched hold of my Webley with both hands, aiming at the chest of the closest dagger-wielding maniac. I was perfectly prepared to shoot the bastard down if he showed even the slightest sign of resistance. But this proved unnecessary, as suddenly all six dropped their knives and calmly got down on their knees, allowing us to move in and handcuff them. I breathed a sigh of relief, but this feeling proved to be short-lived. When we unmasked the suspects, we discovered they were 4 males and 2 females of varied ages. They refused to give their names and carried no forms of ID or any personal items, for that matter. We arrested them on suspicion of trespassing, animal cruelty, and possession of offensive weapons. The Sarge seemed unsettled by the whole affair, saying he'd never seen anything like it in all of his 20 years of service. But what really shook me to my core was when one of the suspects turned his head around and looked me directly in the eye, specifically picking me out from the crowd. He was an unpleasant-looking man, perhaps in his late 30s or early 40s. He had one of those weasel-like faces with pale skin and bloodshot eyes. His chin was covered in a thick, untidy stubble, and he stank to the high heavens, which suggested that he hadn't bathed or showered in days. I experienced a cold chill inside me whenever he made eye contact, but I stood my ground, knowing I couldn't show this lowlife any fear. He opened his mouth to reveal chipped yellow teeth, and he spoke in broken English. I didn't recognize the accent, but thought it sounded Eastern European, and what he said was this: "Our master. He sees you. He will come for you. Soon you will have nowhere left to hide." I stood glued to the spot, my jaw hanging in disbelief. His words terrified me, and I had no response. One of my comrades reacted, punching the suspect in the stomach and telling him in no uncertain terms to shut his fucking gob. 2 officers dragged the man away while I remained frozen, unable to speak or move, until the sergeant patted my back, telling me to head back to the waiting Land Rovers. I didn't sleep a wink last night after I got home. Instead, I turned to the bottle once again, drinking until dawn. I realized this isn't a solution, but I needed something to settle me after what I'd been through. In the morning, I received a phone call from the duty sergeant. He told me that all 6 suspects arrested at the mill had been released without charge. Apparently, the orders had come from the top, but no explanation was given. The sergeant mentioned reports of other ritualistic animal sacrifices and black masses occurring across Ulster, and of rumored links to British military intelligence. The theory was that it was some kind of psychological operation aimed against the paramilitaries and their supporters. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Is there no end to this madness? Has this entire city descended into the depths of hell? How much more can one man be expected to take? I almost died today. They literally came within inches of taking me out. It had been a quiet couple of weeks, or at least as quiet as a cop working in Belfast could have been. I was still on the beat with the uniformed patrols. There had been incidents, of course, but none as bizarre and unsettling as that encounter in the old mill. I hadn't received any threatening phone calls in the last fortnight, had cut down on my drinking, and was even sleeping better. I truly believed I had turned a corner, but you can never take your eye off the ball in this job. Our unit got called out to a crime scene in Ballymurphy. The switchboard received a call reporting a break-in, and so we were sent out to investigate. As usual, we went out in strength, attending in armored Land Rovers and fully armed. Details were sketchy, so we were naturally suspicious. Rightly so, as it transpired, because this caution saved our lives. The device was hidden inside a dustbin left in a side alley. I was only about 12 feet away from the bomb when it detonated. I remember a blinding light and a deafening din, followed a split second later by a powerful wave of heat that blew me off my feet, throwing me backwards. I hit the ground hard, feeling a sharp pain shoot through my entire body. After that, I lay dazed on the pavement, my head throbbing, my vision blurred, and my ears still ringing from the blast. The dark figure appeared from nowhere and stood right above me. My eyesight was still affected, so I could not make out his facial features. In fact, he was little more than a dark shadow standing over my stricken body, blocking out the sun. Nevertheless, I knew it was him, the same shadowy figure who's been stalking me for weeks. And now he had me, wounded and helpless, completely at his mercy. My vision was starting to come back, but I couldn't bear to look at this hideous figure, and so I closed my eyes and prepared for the end. Seconds passed, and slowly my hearing returned. I heard men shouting, and the heavy clump of boots against the pavement. Reluctantly, I opened my eyes, and to my great relief, the dark man was gone, his shadowy figure replaced by the concerned looks of my comrades as they came to my aid. Miraculously, I walked away from the blast with only minor injuries, cuts and bruises, and a slight concussion. A piece of flying shrapnel had grazed my head, a couple of inches to the right, and it would have been embedded in my skull. It didn't take long for the investigating officers to establish that the device was the work of Nemesis, the IRA bomber responsible for so many previous attacks in this part of the city. The bomb design and style of attack were both very similar to those that killed the young soldier back in January. It seems that on this occasion, the IRA member tasked with detonating the device missed his mark. The bomb had gone off a tad too early. If he'd waited just a couple more seconds to detonate, then I would be dead and several of my colleagues would be severely maimed. As it turned out, we all walked away from the blast in one piece. I should be feeling like the luckiest man alive right now. But I don't. The dark figure is back. I don't know whether he's a man or some kind of ghoulish entity, but I do know he's out to get me. My colleagues think I'm either mad or delusional, and my boss has put me on an extended leave of absence. But it won't matter. He, or it, failed on this occasion, but he won't stop until I'm on the ground. My days are numbered. It's only a matter of time now. The calls have started again, worse than ever this time. The things I've listened to were surely never meant for human ears. I'm disconnecting my phone. There's no reason for anybody to be calling me. I'm still on a leave of absence from work, but I find no respite. I spend my nights drinking with my gun by my side. I can't sleep for any length of time. Every time I close my eyes, my mind is filled with these horrifying images. He's always there, haunting my dreams. I know he is watching me. I'll never be free. My sister came to my house this afternoon. I guess she's worried about me. She's probably been trying to call me, but can't get through with the phone unplugged. She was at the door for more than 15 minutes, repeatedly banging the knocker and ringing the bell. I didn't answer. All my curtains were drawn, and the lights were turned off. She must have thought I was out, so she eventually gave up. I can't bear for her to see me like this, her big brother reduced to a cowardly, drunken mess. It's for the best anyway. Whatever is happening to me, whoever is after me, I can't let my little sister get involved. I need to protect her. The IRA bomber known as Nemesis is dead. The security forces played no role in his demise. Ironically, he died by his own hands after a bomb he was working on detonated prematurely, blowing him to bits and demolishing the safe house he was sequestered inside. It's an occupational hazard for those in his line of work. My bosses would rather have arrested and convicted the bastard, but they weren't necessarily dissatisfied with the outcome. Neither was I, at least not at first. My commander invited me to attend the scene. I was still technically on suspension, but my boss was willing to bend the rules to allow me to be there when they carried the bomber's dismembered body parts out of the rubble. The bastard tried to kill me after all, so the hope was that his violent death would grant me some closure. We arrived on the street to discover a chaotic scene, with the road cordoned off at both ends, while soldiers and police officers dug through the rubble of the demolished house. While the security forces worked, predictable crowds gathered around the cordons. Some young men swore and shouted abuse at the soldiers, but mostly people were just curious. One woman stood out though. A young woman with long red hair tied back in a bun. She was clearly upset and very agitated, screaming at the troops about a missing child. It took us some time to establish what had happened. The woman's child was an 8-year-old girl called Oif. She'd been playing on the street in front of the safe house at the exact moment the bomb exploded. We found her dead body buried underneath the rubble about an hour later. Her mother wailed in all-encompassing grief when we carried her little girl out, grabbing hold of the tiny body and grasping it tightly to her bosom. I've seen a lot of terrible things during my time, but nothing as tragic as this. And he was there, of course, the dark man, lingering in the shadows just outside of the cordon, watching on and mocking me. It seems he is drawn to death, destruction, and human agony. I think he thrives on it. I attempted to ignore him, but I could still feel his hateful glare burning into the back of my head. I returned home afterwards and instantly hit the bottle. I couldn't stop thinking about that poor little girl. What had she ever done to deserve this? I thought of my younger sister and how I'd feel if something so awful happened to her. Later that night, I turned on the radio to listen to the news report of today's incident. The IRA had released a statement describing the dead bomber as a brave Irish patriot who gave his life in the cause of freedom, while young Oif's death was a tragic accident and a painful reminder of the British occupation of our country. I saw red when I heard those words, grabbing an empty vodka bottle and flinging it across the room at the radio, smashing both into pieces. I couldn't stand the hypocrisy. There would be condemnations, of course, but it would make no difference. The war would go on. The horror never ends. He came to my home last night. My safe haven has been breached. It happened at about 2 in the morning. Finally, after weeks of insomnia, I managed to nod off and get some sleep, only to be awoken by a noise outside my window during the early hours. I rubbed my tired eyes and got out of bed, creeping across the room and sheepishly peeking through the curtains at the street below. My heart almost stopped when I saw him standing there, as bold as you like. Again, I could see little in the dim light, but it was definitely him. The same dark figure who's been stalking me for weeks. He stood perfectly still on the opposite side of the street, glaring up at my bedroom window, his dark shape casting a foreboding shadow across the pavement. I was frozen in fear for a moment, unable to avert my gaze or move from the window. It was one thing to see this dark stalker at a crowded crime scene, but now he was here, at my home. I had no soldiers or police colleagues to back me up, and I'd never felt so alone in my whole life. I knew he'd come for me, and I was sure this was the endgame. But suddenly, my fear was replaced by angry defiance. I was determined not to go down without a fight. Tearing myself away from the window, I grabbed my revolver from my bedside drawer and stormed out of the room, tearing down the staircase and making for the front door. I flung the door open and dashed out onto the pavement, brandishing my loaded revolver as I went. I was determined to unload 6 bullets into the bastard's head, but my enemy was gone, having seemingly disappeared without a trace. I frantically searched the street in both directions, but there was nothing. After several minutes, I realized it wouldn't look good if my neighbors saw me brandishing a gun in the middle of our quiet suburban street, so I retreated back inside my house. I knew the bastard would be back, so I barricaded the doors and stood guard by the window, my weapon drawn and at the ready. I didn't expect to last the night, but I made it to dawn. I'm sure the dark man is taunting me, prolonging my misery before he finally strikes. I'm not a religious man, but tonight I prayed. I don't think anyone is listening, I just want this to end, one way or another. I spent all day keeping guard, drinking cheap vodka, clutching my gun, and keeping a weary eye on the street. I know he or she will be back. I've had a lot of time to think during these long and tense hours and to recall all the awful scenes I've witnessed over the last few weeks. I truly believe that evil has taken hold of this country, infecting the hearts of men and making them commit the most heinous of crimes. It seems like God has abandoned this land, leaving us in the hands of demons that walk the earth. What is this creature that stalks me? I am sure it is not of this world. The morning was quiet, a calm before the storm. At lunchtime, I heard a mighty blast in the distance, probably caused by a bomb attack in the town center. The violence continues unabated, and this evil entity feeds off it. I've made it to dusk, but I know it'll come for me under the cover of darkness. He's here, standing in the exact same spot as last night. I'm watching him as I write this, and he's staring right back at me. I'm tired of living in fear. I'm going to confront him, whatever the hell he is, and this time he won't slip through my fingers. I saw its face. I looked into its eyes. Dear God, those eyes. He is not a man or a human being. Of this, I have no doubt. When he lowered his hood, I saw something I could not comprehend. Those demonic orbs in place of its eyes stared into my very soul. It took everything from me, leaving nothing but an empty shell. I will never forget what I saw. Every time I close my eyes, I see him. I see the bodies and the bomb sites. With all the evil that has taken hold, I can't go on like this. There is only one way out. Whoever finds this diary, please tell my parents and sister that I love them and that I'm sorry. Please, God, show me mercy. Well, that's it. My late uncle's lost journal, transcribed word for word. Needless to say, I found it very emotional to read, and I've been having difficulties coming to terms with his story. I now understand why my mother refused to talk about her brother's death throughout her whole life. After reading his account, I dug deeper, carrying out my own research in an attempt to verify the details. As you probably guessed, my uncle killed himself soon after writing his final entry. He shot himself through the head using his service revolver. Sadly, suicides were all too common for serving RUC officers, which is unsurprising given the immense stress of their job. I was able to confirm most of the incidents he described, including the murders and bombings. It all happened. However, there is no record of the arrests at the Black Mass. If this sort of thing did occur, it must have been kept out of the history books. I really don't know what to think about my uncle's account. The most logical explanation is that he suffered a mental breakdown due to the stresses of his job, or was suffering from PTSD. Isolated and without professional help, he was unable to sleep and drank heavily to dull his pain. This, in turn, could have resulted in paranoid delusions, making him see things that weren't really there. I would like to believe this and find some closure to the whole affair. However, there is one detail I've not been able to explain away. While making my inquiries, I was able to speak with one of the officers who attended my uncle's house after his suicide. The man has long since retired from the police force, but he remembered that day vividly. He described manning a cordon while my uncle's body was removed from the house and loaded into a waiting ambulance. During this grim procession, he recalls seeing the solitary figure watching from the end of the street, a hooded man dressed in dark robes, his face covered. The officer says he was momentarily distracted by the ambulance driving off. When he turned back, the figure was gone. Who the hell needs a private investigator during quarantine? I was obviously grateful to have contact from any client while socially distancing myself, even one that would probably turn out to be some kind of scam. Staying indoors had me going insane. As Steve McCroskey once said, I picked the wrong year to quit drinking. I had given up the sauce right after a spectacularly failed New Year's party, and 4 months deep into it, and being stuck doing Jack's *** all day, I really needed a drink. Plus, my business, the investigator racket, had gone from emaciated to straight-up skeletal. The slow trickle of cash flow that kept food in the bellies of me and my 4 employees had been sufficiently staunched by the virus. Business was never booming. You work through word of mouth when you aren't associated with one of the big investigation firms that mainly employs ex-cops and exploits criminology graduates. My work was boots on the ground stuff, and my boots were firmly on the shoe rack, and my ass was on the couch. People weren't hiring me to check on their unfaithful partners because they were stuck inside with them all day, wishing they were out cheating. There were no mysteries or beers that needed cracking, so all I could do was eat likes ***, play video games, pound off, and worry about the financial future of my business while I lay awake, painfully sober. Then $50,000 dangles in front of my face, and like the small fish in the big pond that I am, I bite, ignoring the glint of curved, barbed steel. My brain was stagnating for a case, so I started to hyper-analyze the email right away. He had sent it from his work email, no doubt to add an air of authenticity to it. I Googled the domain. It seemed legitimate. That meant he wasn't afraid of the security personnel who read company emails to know his personal business, or more likely, he had blocked them from accessing his emails because he's the owner, and it's good to have a hypocrite at the top. The email had a standard company signature at the end of it, adding another layer of authenticity, as well as driving the point home that he was very much a CEO, and I very much was not. Or maybe I was a little bitter from sleepless nights agonizing about an empty bank account. Probably both. The most surprising aspect was the fact that he told me the details of the case, or at least the meat of it, right away, before any correspondence. That spoke to either his urgency and desperation, or he knew the case was strange, which would entice me in ways the money couldn't. I mean, I don't really give us *** about the plight of a pharmaceutical bigwig who got rich by jacking up the price of Ritalin. How do you even get rich on medicine in Canada without feeling like a douchebag? Not to mention, a few years ago, his son served some serious prison time in an American jail for selling unregulated drugs to various hospitals. The drugs had turned out to be stored in unsafe conditions, basements, the back of cars, and were next to useless when they reached the patients, who suffered serious negative effects. Honestly, this family, but when I say that, I'm saying ***, my own family, employees, because we all deserve to get paid. $50,000 split 5 ways is still a few months' rent in Toronto. So I was giving the case some serious thought. Honestly, I think the guy told me the details of the case right away because they involved his daughter, and my business had the shitty reputation of being run on emotion. Tracking down lost teddy bears and bullshit like that is fun. Everyone likes taking on a case that helps a kid. So the thickening agent of the whole mystery was that he wanted me to track down who had given his daughter the COVID. Already, it's super bizarre, and I kind of love it. He claims that he suspects she snuck out of the house, went to a party, and caught it from some reckless youth. I sit there, pondering whether to message him back. It seems morally dubious to help an obscenely wealthy man track down a kid that he intended to sue, but the chances of a rich kid sneaking out to see other rich kids were pretty high, so this would end up being a case of 2 well-off families duking it out in court, and I don't mind throwing a little fuel on that flame, especially if it keeps my cupboards full of instant noodles. Maybe I had drunk too many coffees to replace whiskey, but I decided to email him back. It doesn't cost a thing to be curious, unless you're a cat. I asked him for some more details, like what makes him think she has COVID and not just the flu. What makes him certain his daughter snuck out? Does he have any suspects? The usual. Right off the bat, alarmingly fast, like I picture him hunched over his laptop, Frantically refreshing his email to see if I respond kind of fast, he replies. Along with the reply is a money transfer of $25,000. Half now, half upon completion. I assume. How gosh, what could I do? The money was already mine. I didn't even get a chance to say no to the money. I mean, if you want to get all technical about it, I could have rejected the money transfer on my bank's website instead of clicking that unassuming gray button that accepted it. I'm human and poor. So the case was opened. He's as helpful as a big floppy hat in a windstorm, telling me that he's sure it's COVID, that he absolutely knows that she snuck out, and that he has no idea who she hangs out with. This turns into a back and forth between my being reasonable, I'm allowed to be a dick, I already have the fucking money, and him being a standard rich white dude. I tell him to contact the public health agency or whoever. I'm not a doctor. I tell him to stay inside, and especially keep her inside if he suspects she has been sneaking out. He tells me no doctors. They'd find a way to mess up his fame and wealth and deserved revenge for his unscrupulous business tactics in regard to medicine. I ask if he has any servants who could have spread the virus to her, and he counters indignantly that his staff haven't been able to butter his brass, shine his toast, or whatever. He's really miffed that thousands of people dying are negatively affecting his ability to never touch an appliance. Finally, and I can tell he has been ramping up to this stomach punch, he asks if I'm this disbelieving of all my clients, especially the mob. Yes, I also have a reputation for taking cases from the mob. He kind of breezes over the fact that I took those cases to either clear my own name of murder charges, stop someone from being murdered, or prevent myself from being murdered myself. The bottom line is that he knows I took mob money, which means I'm fine with working extra legally, and that's exactly how he wants this handled. Okie dokie. I tell him to call me and give him my number. He says he doesn't see the need, and I say I don't care what he sees. He's hired me. Yes, he fucking hired me, because I see what he doesn't. So he calls fairly quickly. The quickness is important, because the call display says his name. Normally, I know that given a little bit of time, a phone number can be tampered with to read as if it is someone else's via call display, but I'm assuming I didn't give him the time to do that. I also make a mental note to call it later to try and catch the dude off guard. Yes, I'm this suspicious of all my clients. Over the phone, all the bluster that filled his emails is faltering, because every time he starts going on an entitled tirade, I talk over him. I anticipate his boardroom bullshit, his mergers and acquisitions energy, and his rampant, aggressive, in-your-face car salesmanship. I'm an employee, so he's used to being benevolent when it suits him but condescending and belligerent whenever I show some spine. But I'm not that kind of employee. For one, I have his money. For two, I have his secret. And for three, I don't have a sick daughter. All he has is the second half of the money, which I might be okay with walking away from. I tend to be fickle. So he genuinely has to figure out what limits he has with me. And the limit is that he needs to stop treating me like I'm from his first abusive marriage. He needs to talk only when I need him to. This power dynamic feels nice for a change. He's probably going to use his vast power to ruin my life, once the case is over, of course. But that happens to every third client for me. So what do I care? I ask him for his daughter's name, which he is hesitant to give. For once, I get it. I'm a voice over the phone, and I could be a pervert, so instinctively, he's guarding her. Eventually, his wisdom talks down his reptile dad's brain, and he gives it. I wrote this down because I'm bad with names. Amber. Sufficiently both upper class and new age. Classic. I then ask for a list of Amber's friends, and he draws a big fat goose egg. He doesn't meddle in his children's affairs. Helpful. Then I ask for his address, which he doesn't understand at all. I explain that I need to know the architecture and layout of the neighborhood to better retrace his daughter's footsteps. He harumphs appropriately and says he supposes that makes sense. It doesn't. I made that up. I have no intention to do any of that. To make it seem like these are important clues, I ask for the names of his business partners, his working relationships, any enemies he might have, his wife, and his ex-wives. I want him to think he's getting his money's worth of detective work. I really do write these down, but in a kind of lackluster handwriting that looks like the pen just kind of sadly rolled across the paper and spelled out a couple of names. I get some small satisfaction from the length of his enemy list, especially when I recognize some particularly dangerous names, like Maniac Murphy. Amber is the lead, and since he has openly shown that he has 0 fingers on the pulse of his daughter's social life, I'm going to have to figure out where she snuck off to myself. And he doesn't need to know how I'm going to do that. Peppered inside my useless questions about his church, Wayward Shepherd of Guiding Flocks Church, which is a silly name but I bite my tongue, and how many business buildings he owns. 17 seems like an unreasonable number. I ask what school his daughter attends. Branksome Hall. This he knows, since I'm sure he's filled out checks for the place. Very upscale, only the best for this stranger whom he loves. I tell him I'll contact him if I think of any questions, and that I'll give him updates on the case. He turns this into a scheduled thing, because his business brain never turns off, and I tell him I'll give him a call at 3 every day. He wants an email. I'm already giving an inch with the phone call, instead of texting, which I assumed these pressed suit types dig, but now he's just going for a power play again. I don't have the spoons to fight him on this. Fine, he'll get a daily email. Now comes the outsourcing. As great an undercover detective as I am, I'm not particularly adept at impersonating teenage girls, which I'm going to need to do if I'm going to grill Amber for details. I could make a go of it, but then if she ever asks to video chat, I suddenly need to frantically find a real live teenage girl to go in front of the camera. And if her cadence and mannerisms are different from the way I've been typing, the jig is up. Plus, the creep factor is through the roof. I have enough problems without ending up on a wash list. Luckily for me, I have an outside consultant. Clarissa is a girl who regularly hires me whenever money gets tight for her. She comes from an extraordinarily rich background. She has me dig up dirt on her mom, dad, stepmom, and stepdad, and then proceeds to blackmail them out of their own vast fortune. She paid me at the beginning, but for the last few sessions, I took a reduced price and asked that she owe me a few favors. Having an insider worming through the upper crust of society can have a variety of uses. In my experience, in this city, rich people all hang out in the same circles. It gets even worse for kids, who are all forced to attend the same stuffy private schools. So I hit up Clarissa and gave her the deets on Amber. I ask her if she can send her a friend request on Facebook. I'm sure she has friends in common. I'm laughed at for still using Facebook, but she says she knows Amber already. She won't tell me what social media platform they use. I'm not cool enough. Fair. I ask her to find out if Amber has been sneaking out of the house, and if so, where. I trust Clarissa implicitly to know how to work it in organically. I know that a spoiled brat blackmailing her parents doesn't scream smart as a whip, but she uses the money for pretty charitable causes, and sometimes drugs. She's still a teenager, so her head and heart are always in the right place. Understandably, it'll take her a while to build up to getting a girl to spill her guts, so I leave it in her capable hands. While that kettle boils on the back burner, I need to start doing some detective work of my own. I'm itching to get out of the house anyway. The air in here is thick. I've burned too much incense and boiled too many pots of coffee. The video games are blending together. Max Payne, Joel, and Sebastian Castellanos are all the same fucking characters. I'm beginning to enjoy doing dishes. I listen to jazz sometimes. Who am I? To shake off the approaching insanity, I've decided to stretch my legs and steal an expensive car. I know just the one. So, normally, I would just park my rusty bucket PT Cruiser on the street I need to survey, since nobody really looks twice at a PT Cruiser. They resent being forced to look at it even once. That's asterisk won't fly in the ritzy neighborhoods, though, because people will assume that there's an Amber Alert if they see that thing dripping brake fluid anywhere near their fine fescue. So I need something nice. Not Bugatti nice, either. It can't be flashy, collectible, or anything like that. It just needs to cost a lot in its blandness. A Mercedes-Benz SUV should do the trick nicely. Now, I'm not going to keep the fucking thing. I don't hate the environment that much. I'm just going to borrow it for the case from people who won't even know it's gone. There's a rich-ish family that I used to date a member of, and they have that exact car. They're also hiding from the pandemic up in Muskoka, while the rest of us rot in the city, so their house is empty. I only know this because I follow my ex on Twitter in the healthiest way possible. The house being empty is important because I'm not just stealing the car. I'm breaking into their house. I can't really hotwire a car made after like 1985, and for this fancy of a car, I'd need to be a pretty adept hacker, engineer, or electrician. I'm amateurish at best. I could hire one of those, but that means more outsourcing, and I don't have the time. It's easier to just break into the house, take the car keys, and take off. I have a spare key. I never returned mine after the breakup. Ain't I a stinker? And I know the security code for the house. It should be simple. And it is. Eerily simple. I don't even need my spare key. The front door is unlocked. It's odd, but people can be forgetful. The house is cold, too. I feel an intense draft coming from upstairs, like a window is open, half out of creeping dread and half out of respect for people's privacy. I'm a BD, not a fucking BD. I decide not to investigate upstairs. The house feels wrong, and not just because I'm breaking and entering. I do that all the time. No, the house feels like it's in the first stages of being abandoned, but I can't put my finger on why. I look for a few details while on my way to the wooden bowl they keep the car keys in. There are plates on the kitchen counter, which is out of character for everyone in this fastidious house. I think I hear a tap running in the basement. A lamp is on in the living room. I chalk it up to the family leaving in a rush. More than one of them had tons of anxiety, so maybe the pandemic had them pulling their hair out. Sure, people do funny stuff. I grab the keys and scamper off to the garage like the intruder I am. Idly, I notice that all the pictures of the family have been taken down. No, not exactly taken down. There are holes and rips in the wall where the nails used to hang. They were torn down in a rush, but there is no broken glass from the frames on the floor. People do funny stuff. I hurriedly swap the PT for the Mercedes-Benz in the garage. I swear I'm hurrying so I'm not seen by neighbors, not because I'm scared. So now I have a bad feeling in my stomach and an ill-gotten vehicle, and I'm back on the road. I grabbed my bug-out bag, complete with the Blackmagic pocket camera and the Canon, from the trunk of the cruiser before I left it in the best garage it's ever been in. It's time to stake out Amber's abode and see if I can catch a girl sneaking out of her house. I pick up PG Clucks on the way for stakeout food. I make a mental note not to leave any greasy chicken stains on the rich Corinthian leather. I pull onto the street and make a silent, thankful prayer to the detective gods that it isn't a gated community. I veer off in my patented private investigator seclusion and watch the house. I'm practically invisible. I'm a goddamn vehicular ninja. The house sits large and layered. The jewel of the crown is this McMansion terra. There's a wall to keep unwanted watchers and neighbors at a healthy distance, as if the massive lawn and roundabout driveway didn't do that enough. From what I can see from the street, the windows on all 3 floors are all dark. There looms a massive dark forest behind the property, and I know from doing my homework that even if the kid did beat her feet into those woods, she would wander them for about an hour before coming out at either a golf course or a health center. I'm fairly confident that any self-respecting rebel would just sneak out the front door. I opted not to snap any photos. There's nothing to look at so far, and it's not like I can show the client that I was watching his castle. Plus, I'll have a hard enough time explaining to a cop why I'm parked here with a slew of cameras without having a memory card full of a teenage girl's darkened windows. A few hours pass without an event, and I'm resenting the soggy fries. I have a moment to myself to get pissed at COVID for a brand new reason. The food. Usually, one of the perks of having a rich client is the food. When you first show up at their inevitable mansion, they will have the most opulent food you can think of set out. They know the detectives make buff ***, all for money before taxes, so they finally have an audience to show off their grandeur to. They'll have quail eggs and caviar, just laid out. Then they'll come out in their tennis shorts and have a nosh. Like eating this goat-acular spread is a regular and casual occurrence for them. I wouldn't complain. Free fancy grub for me before I go back to lengthening my tapeworm on craft dinner. While I stew in my non-problems, something happens. There's an amateur on the street in a jet black, expensive Range Rover. Someone who isn't as good at staking out a mark as I am, because again, I'm great. They're checking their phone in their car, and even through tinted windows, the blue light is shining through. Plus, they're moving around a heck of a lot, causing subtle shifts in the suspension of the car. Fucking rookie. Learn from a book. Who the hell is watching the same house as I am? With my screen brightness turned down so low it's basically braille, I'm keeping in contact with Clarissa, who is not filling me with hope. She tells me that Amber is a goody two-shoes and doesn't sneak out. Amber's all torn up because her precious father is accusing her of breaking the rules. Plus, she really is sick. Super sick. Clarissa tells me that when they spoke on video chat, incredibly careful to avoid telling me what app they're using because I'm so uncool. Amber looked like she warmed up. She also went above and beyond and pressed Amber for her symptoms, which were increasingly worrying. She says that on top of the fever and body pain, she is also spitting blood and losing her back teeth. I don't ask how Clarissa got friendly enough to squeeze these intimate details out of her. I tell Clarissa she's doing amazing work, as always, and ask her to get more if she can, but at least stay in contact with Amber to make sure she's all right. Update me if anything changes. I'm left to ponder these new case details while I keep one eye on the mansion and one eye on the shadowy car parked across the way. Amber's symptoms sound like something different, if not worse, than COVID. So while that doesn't seem to be the detail her father hired me to find out, it seems like an important one. This could be a case of a dreadfully sick girl, a paranoid father, and a poorly timed outbreak creating a perfect storm of medical mishaps. Calling 911, or at least the Children's Aid Society, needs to happen sooner rather than later. The mystery. But then, who is the goon in the Rover? They're clearly not even slightly versed in the art of being a low-life stalker, but they're bankrolled enough to afford a high-end car like that. Everything was getting weird. And not a cool weird, like trying butt stuff for the first time, but a scary weird, like the ingredients in cereal. The sun begins to chase away the night sky, and that's when my co-watcher decides to peel out of there. I slump in my seat out of habit, despite being safe behind tinted glass, and try to get a better look at the plates of the fleeing vehicle. It's a personalized plate. Shivdi. Something to look into later. I snapped my first picture of the night. Well, I have no idea what the *** to do with that information. So in an attempt to feel like I have some control of the situation, I decide to follow up on a hunch. I grab some nitrile gloves from the bug-out bag, lather them in antiseptic gel, and grab a mask, which I hurriedly hook onto my ears. I bend the metal guide of the mask onto my nose, give a shifty-looking glance up and down the street, grab the cannon, and I'm off. It feels good to be doing some boots on the ground, even if it was for a case that was quickly feeling hinky. It's funny the things you miss when you're stuck at home, resenting the color of paint your landlord won't let you change. You miss the squeak of your combat boots across a smooth blacktop. No potholes in this neighborhood. I wonder why. You miss the chance to parkour over some ostentatiously high yard walls. You miss that goofy half-crouching run you do to avoid being seen, like you aren't a stooped figure out in the open, running across the world's largest lawn. You miss the feeling of a clunky camera banging against your chest and knees, definitely voiding the warranty. You missed scaling a drain pipe, or whatever the heck that pipe was. You even miss glancing around the neighborhood, so people don't mistake you for a regular peeping Tom and not a professional one. My heart is pounding because I could die at any second. If someone on the street sees me, they're going to call the cops. And that's, like, the last thing I need. Worse, someone could look out of the house and catch me creeping along their rooftops, in which case I'd probably be shot, which I also don't need. I feel a pang of guilt as I begin looking in windows, trying to find a young girl's room. Despite my profession and my actions, I really don't enjoy violating people's privacy like this. I see the man who hired me sleeping, mouth agape. I see his wife sleeping in another room, indicative of how great their marriage is. I note that nothing looks amiss at either of these windows. I also note the layout of the house and how I passed a large bathroom window before I finally came across Amber's room. She's sleeping fretfully, tossing and turning at a rapid pace, clearly in the middle of a fever dream. In the snatches of her face I do see, her face is contorted in pain, and her skin is slick with sweat and also pale yellow. Her phone was close by, on a desk next to her bed, under an expensive pink lamp. A half-drunk glass of water has beads dripping onto a coaster. Who the f*** has a coaster in their bedroom? Inoffensive band posters pepper the walls at respectable intervals. I don't know how her father can think she's ever done anything bad. When I was her age, I was not in bed at this hour, and my room was a smoky mess. Hers is tidy, and it looks like you could actually get some serious studying done. Heck, my office at work isn't this clean. My brain wonders how afraid you have to be of your parents in order to have a room like this when I noticed the clue I thought might be here. There were clear signs of a break-in at her window, with paint being broken in a groove and splintered wood being pushed away from the wound. It was fresh, too, with no sign of wind or rain smoothing out the sudden rupture. Someone had broken in, not her breaking out. I look for any more clues, but I can't make out much in the meager morning light. I shake off the feeling of being a worthless creep and snap pictures of what I can. The evidence of someone having broken in, mostly after that, I shamefully slink back to my stolen car and begin the long drive back into poorer neighborhoods. The drive back is dreadful. I breathe hard into a mask, which does nothing to filter out the smell of stale chicken grease. I realize that I hurt my shoulder when I scaled the wall, and only now is it starting to throb. All that running, climbing, and ninja training helped me work up the kind of thirst and soreness that's only settled by a cold rum and coke. Why in God's name would someone break into a teenage girl's bedroom? How did that relate to her sickness? Why was her father so convinced that she didn't have COVID? Who the f*** is Shade UD? My brain rolls right into the Tom Shud mystery, which is 80 years old and almost certainly unrelated to whatever bullshit is uncoiling in front of me. But what if? While driving the speed limit like an asshole, I carefully peel off the nitrile gloves and deposit them in my takeout bag for later disposal. I re-sanitize my hands and use voice activation to have my phone dial Piggy friend. That's a cop that I'm acquainted with. Oak, I'm blackmailing him. Don't blame me if he tried selling coke to one of my employees. He works a night shift, so I know he'll be at the station right now. He picks himself up, surprisingly plucky. Despite being blackmailed, he's always been cordial, which is nice, I suppose. I tell him I need to run a plate. At first, he gives me the runaround, telling me it doesn't work like in the movies. He can't just look up a plate at the drop of a hat. I let him go through the motions of telling me why being a police officer is more technical than a civilian like me could possibly understand. He gets it out of his system. So while his ego is already stroking itself, I wrap a second hand around that shaft and explain how an officer as powerful and resourceful as him could figure a way around the red tape. I keep it to myself that it seems kind of fucking stupid that he's willing to smuggle out blows from the evidence locker but not to run a plate. He agrees, and I tell him to look up "should." He asks if he heard it correctly. When I tell him he has, he smugly brings up the Tom should case. I tell him I may have solved it, and he doesn't pick up on the sarcasm. He'll never be a detective, by the way. I hear some keyboard clacking coming from his end of the conversation, which tells me that looking up the plates was easier than he let on. He then tells me that the plates are registered to the Wayward Shepherd of Guiding Flocks Church. Oddly, that's the same church the client told me he went to. I know I was only half paying attention because I thought it was a useless detail, but it's hard to forget a nonsense word salad like that. Shouldn't the flock be wayward, and the shepherd be guiding? I ask my guy if it's normal for a church to own a car, and he tells me it absolutely isn't, nor is it legal. He doesn't know how this kind of paperwork ever passed through the system. He'll resolve it. I asked him to hold off on resolving that until I finish my investigation, if he could. I don't need them to go to the ground before I chase down all my leads. He reluctantly agrees, annoyed that he has to hold off on his own super important cop work. The sun is blasting my eyes right out of my skull at this point, so I figure it's an acceptable hour to contact one of my employees. I demand that my phone call up my head researcher, also my only researcher, and my secretary or assistant. I get him to start looking into Wayward Shepherd of Guiding Flocks Church. He agrees that the name is ridiculous. He'll get back to me. I'm back at my ex's eerie pad, and despite it being broad daylight, I dread going back inside. I make sure nobody in the neighborhood is watching as I pull back in. As I park the car back in its rightful place, my depressing PT looks like a heap next to it. While pondering this sad state of affairs, I swear my car was facing the other direction when I left. I chalk it up to nerves. Plus, I have the car keys on me, so someone moving it should be impossible. But I sort of have an eye for details. I'm a goddamn private eye, I would swear. I creep back in the house, tiptoeing more carefully this time than my first intrusion, for reasons I don't admit to myself. Beams of buttery sunlight prop up the windows at delicate angles, and large clouds of dust hang motionless in the air, frozen impossibly in time. More dust than you find inside a lived-in home, if you ask me. Through a kitchen window, I see the backyard illuminated fully by the day. A rusty stake is pounded into the earth, something that wasn't there back when I was a wanted visitor. Tied to the stake is a dog collar. I remember the dog, and I never remember it being tied up. Probably nothing. I'm back at the wooden bowl, and I flippantly chuck the keys in there. I want to prove to myself that I'm not afraid of this home, and that I know it's empty. I can make as much sound as I want. I tell myself, as the keys jangle noisily into their home. A creak upstairs, where that cold draft is coming from. What is probably the house settling, but absolutely sounds like a chair squeaking across a floor. My mouth goes dry, and I think to myself whether it would be okay to check their fridge for some wine. I'm about to call out who's there, and the question gets lodged somewhere on the way out. I have no desire to know if someone is up there, and I certainly have no desire for them to know I'm here. I pause to see if there are any more sounds. No, I'm not freezing in panic. I'm preparing a lie. It would be easier to explain my presence than to try to flee out of the house, start my car, peel away, and also shut the garage behind me. Despite all those logical thoughts, my hand is still clamping a knife I keep on me. When nothing further happens, I slowly back out of the house. I'm silent. I curse my clunky boots. Why wouldn't I wear sneakers for sneaking? My eyes are fixed on the stairwell. If whatever is up there comes bumbling down, that's where they'll come from to get me. I take all traces of myself. I leave the chicken stink behind, out of the car, and put it back in the cruiser. I start up my bucket of bolts as quietly as a decade-old engine can and glide to the end of the driveway. I locked up behind me. A gloomy drive back to my shanty, alone with insane and implausible thoughts, has zero events. As I pull into my parking space, a back alley cove under the fire escape, a Range Rover lumbers past at a suspiciously slow speed. I don't manage to catch the license plates. The keys can't enter my door lock fast enough. And I'm back inside. I put my mask into a bowl, washed my hands, and began to boil a kettle of water to pour over my mask. I take a wooden folding chair out of a forgotten corner of my cramped apartment and place it at the window, where I can watch my parking space. On a hunch, I plop my phone, my laptop, some muscle relaxants, a gun, the pocket cam, and just so fucking much coffee on the windowsill and prep for my workday. The relaxants taste more acidic than I remember. I wash them down with caffeinated bitterness. The area smells of long overdue cleaning and dust baking on glass in the heat of the sun. When I was a child, I assumed this was what all windows smelled like, associating the smell with glass rather than a need for cleaning. I used to spend a lot of my childhood looking out windows at the world beyond, smelling that glass and dust bouquet. I wonder why these thoughts are in my mind now. It's not like I don't have more pressing matters to worry about. People do funny stuff. I sip the acrid coffee, wishing it had at least the bite of some whiskey in it, and in classic pathetic fallacy fashion, the sunny day begins to cloud over rapidly. I can smell the approaching rain in the air, despite all my windows being closed. I once read that human beings are better at smelling rain than sharks are at smelling blood. I never bothered to check if that was true or not. I still don't know what to do about Amber's declining health. If I report it to the authorities, I could be shooting myself in the foot and cutting off avenues for future investigations. Am I being selfish? While I ponder how to approach a medical emergency, I get a call from my researcher. He's done some digging into the wayward shepherd of Guiding Flocks Church and its members. Through a digital trail that I'm rapidly becoming too old to follow, he's traced about 70% of the membership back to one single company. My client's company, my researcher, also said that all of the websites for the wayward shepherd of Guiding Flocks Church seemed odd, outdated, and banal. I tell him that's what church websites are like. He tells me not to like this. He found backdoors, links, and areas of the website that only responded to certain words or phrases and led to completely different layouts. If you make a donation of $17.45, you get access to a brand new suggestion box. If you type in the word "shugiti" into the suggestion box, a flurry of new pages opens up to you. Weird pages. He took screenshots, which he sent over to my email. I thank him for doing an amazing job and for keeping digging up anything he can find. The new email bubbles up on my screen, and I scroll through the screenshots, glancing over at my car every few moments. As my fingers dash and scroll across the touchpad, the window begins to blur under the first dapples of rain. I inwardly compliment my assistant for having the reservation to downplay how completely fucking batshit these screenshots are. There are talks of people becoming the beasts that we once used to fornicate with. There are pages of nonsense rants about filling some colossal belly with all the gold of the earth, while the faithful dance as mites in chaotic fur. They describe society as the true hell we were condemned to for forgetting the taste of our brother's blood. There's a bizarre metaphor about a suit and tie being a massive hammer with which to grind peasants into a paste, to become the lubricant that will usher children into the paradise of flesh and skies. Oh good, a cult, that's refreshing. Luckily, we haven't stumbled across any photographs of anything untoward happening, so this might just all be an ARG or some such thing. I hold on to the hope of fiction. That doesn't stop me from jumping when the first bolts of light crack open the gray-black sky. I pore over every image I've been sent, determined to find a clue. But I can't find a single thing of use, just more and more descriptions of a beast world, drawings of beings made of molten gold, and promises of a mountain of broken bodies on top of which creature kings will rule. There also seems to be a page of fan art, which shows office skyscrapers with billowing banners stitched from the skin of human faces. A Rolls-Royce with a human skull hood ornament is being thrown into the engines of a private jet. What really chaps my ass, for reasons I can't explain, is that I can't find the name of their deity anywhere. I'm certain they have one, Some huge thing that loves opulence, violence, and exploitation, because there are hints of this motherfucker everywhere, but no name. I really don't know why this bothers me so much. It's not like I can do anything with the information. It just seems important, you know. When I'm done, I shake the whole thing off. I'm sure this will stick with me for a while, but it's no biggie. I didn't actually see anything horrible happen, just descriptions and art. I've dealt with cults before, so I know what kind of things they can get up to. I got off easy with just a fan page for some shithead god, while I soothe my brain with all-healing coffee, which cures only half as well as a shot of vodka. I look out the window at the car, now runny through the filter of streaming rain. I think I should just go full cliché and take up smoking. Ahead of our scheduled check-in, I call my client. I promise myself and Amber that I'll call CAS and 911 as soon as I have just a few more answers. He picks up after just one ring. I tell him that I have reason to believe that his daughter has not left the house. He doesn't believe me and asks for my sources, which I tell him I am unable to provide. I also tell him that I have good information that his daughter is sick with something other than COVID, and that he needs to get her to a doctor. He scoffs. He's certain it's COVID, and doctors are out of the question. If anything, he will call a specialist to him if it comes to that, which it won't, he assures me. I'm less than assured. Now I press for some details about the wayward shepherd of Guiding Flocks Church. He assures me that the information isn't relevant to the case. Guy's full of assurances all of a sudden. I keep inquiring, but now he becomes suspicious. Why do I want to know? I tell him it's routine questioning, which he doesn't buy at all. Back and forth, and through subtle dialogue cues, I get the impression he left the church, and not on great terms. There's an odd air to the way he describes it, like it's above people of my ilk, but beneath people of his stock. I also sense some fear there. I flat out ask him if anyone there would like to harm him or his family, and he pauses. It's brief, but it's there, like he is just realizing that he might be in danger from them. But again, all assurances were that they wouldn't do that. I ask him what that is, and he gets comedically flustered before saying it was just a vague that, and I should shut the f*** up. He basically founded that church, he tells me. The words tumble out of my stupid fucking mouth before I can think better of them. And I ask him the nature of his church and the name of his God. I can basically hear his eyes narrow in suspicion over the phone. He worships the one true God, obviously. I mean, doesn't every cult think that though? The monotheistic ones, at least. I suppose I've let it slip that I know his church is more of a cult, so I decide to go for broke. I ask him why he left the church. Again, a silence, but this one had a tone of sadness to it. Yes, silence can have a tone. When he finally answers, he sounds the most forlorn I've heard him sound yet, which is saying something considering he thinks his daughter has the coronavirus. He ambiguously states that his faith wasn't strong enough for what was needed. Well, obviously, I can't just let that go and ask him what was needed, and he proceeds to tell me that information is above my pay grade. Ironic, considering he set my pay grade for this case. After hanging up, I wondered how I could contact the authorities anonymously without giving myself away. I need to get some medical help for that kid, but why would anyone believe me? I'm also mentally beginning to see a picture get painted before my eyes. A cult that's a company, or a company that's a cult, begins to get too extreme for their founder, so they poison his daughter. It could be that people do funny stuff. As if on cue, through my window, I spot two goons emerge from a nearby alley and begin to poke around my car. I'm fully fucking alert now, leaning forward in my increasingly uncomfortable seat. I'm rolling on the pocket cam, getting every moment of this happy horseshit. The zoom function allows me to close the distance between my vantage point and their snoopery in ways my eyes never could. My knee-jerk reaction is to get pissed off that these two chuckleheads aren't wearing masks or gloves. If one of these bitches coughs on my car, there's going to be trouble. The one in charge has on a nice blue suit jacket and matching pants with a crisp white shirt, open at the top 2 buttons. His hair is dark, and if it weren't for the rain, I can tell he'd have it in a stylish do to match his stylish tan. He points at different areas of the car before pointing up at my window. Because my lights are turned off and the sky is overcast, I'm confident he can't see me. I get a good look at his face, recording it all the while. Pretty handsome dude, but you can tell most of his good looks come from wealth and living well, not from naturally occurring smolder like mine. He goes back down the alley, out of my line of sight, and leaves his second in command to do whatever it is that needs doing. Enormously tall, brown slacks, a light blue dress shirt rolled up to the elbows, and a boring striped tie. This guy looks like Bizarro Jim Halpert. He hasn't tampered with my card yet, so I haven't been given a reason to race downstairs and beat some answers out of him, which I'm hesitant to do because this guy has a weirdly long body, like he had Marfan syndrome. Fighting him would be like fighting Stretch Armstrong or Dalsum. Because of my elevated position, the rain on the glass, his hunched posture, and his looking down into the cruiser, I can't make out features on his face. Brown hair, pale face, towering with disproportionately long arms. Good luck sending out an all-points bulletin with that description. Keep your eyes peeled for Shaggy Rogers, everyone. He snoops around some more, just looking, like a cave dweller discovering an obelisk. The bizarre pendulums that are his arms swing oddly as he hobbles about. He doesn't take pictures, and he doesn't take notes. I don't know what this asshole expected to find. I'm next to certain this is Shuda's driver, judging by his amateur tailing ability, but he should be planting a bomb or a tracking device or something. Nothing. I genuinely think I saw him sniff the car. And then he stops, just freezes, like he's glitching out. And he turns. He looks up at me. He looked right in my eyes. I should have hidden or something. My apartment is dark, and it's raining. There's no way he can see me right. We stare at each other. His face is too blurry through the rain. But something funny happens to my stomach as I look at it. His ears are enormous and jut out from his head. His eyes are so deep into his face as to seem to be at the back of his skull. The camera is having trouble picking it up through the rain and distance, but his eyes seem to blaze in a furious amber. His mouth, thick and fish-like, with large, uneven-bottomed teeth jutting out, droops in a perpetual scowl. I hesitate to call him ugly, not just because it's a dick move to shame someone for their looks, but more so because he seemed beautifully repugnant. It didn't make sense. I couldn't stop looking, but I also needed to look at anything else. I'm getting a headache. He was weird. That's my official diagnosis. He looked fucking weird. Of course, all of this was seen through a wall of water and a pixelated screen, so I could be way off here. I think I see him smile at me before sauntering off in a grossly bow-legged way. He disappears behind a neighboring building. That was fucked. I pop the memory card into my laptop and frantically begin analyzing the 2 dudes I just saw. I don't recognize them, but I commit their faces to memory so I can pick them out in a lineup. The stretched-out freak proves difficult to memorize, partly because he's blurry even in the footage, and partly because my brain does a good job of forgetting him as soon as I look away. While I ponder whether I am getting that disease that stops you from seeing human faces, I decide to upload the scant few photos I managed to take while on my stakeout. There's Sheishu D, looking as humdrum and expensive as ever. I squint until my face threatens to stay that way, just like my mother warned me. There was no sign of my 2 visitors, but it's frightening to think that just behind this tinted windshield was the same Abraham Lincoln-looking motherfucker that just gave me the death stare. When I come to the conclusion that the picture tells me precisely Jack Ernst, I move on to the jimmied window. As I'm looking over the wood, like I'm going to be able to tell the exact make and model of a crowbar just by looking at a picture, I noticed that some of the room was picked up in the picture as well. There's Amber nestled in some pillows, a sweaty, freckled, and pale arm poking out from some sheets. Freckles. Something in the freckles. It could just be a smaller freckle or a beauty spot. It kind of looks like an injection site, if I'm going to allow myself to be paranoid. I pick up my phone to call someone to tell them to check on Amber when the phone rings in my hand. Clarissa has more news, all of it bad. Clarissa is shaken, and that takes a lot, considering she used her dad's sexual proclivity to blackmail him. She spoke to Amber this morning, who, despite looking worse, seemed oddly serene. I ask her what she means by worse. She describes Amber as bone-like, with her skeleton pushing through her skin. I suggest that people lose weight when sick, and Clarissa shuts that down right away. She knows what a girl rapidly losing weight looks like. She goes to a private school where anorexia is super chic. This looked different. Like her eyes had stayed the same size, but her head had gotten bigger, but her skin hadn't. She could see the blue veins struggling their way across a thin and shiny forehead. And when Amber stood up during video chat, Clarissa would swear she was taller. I tell her that's impossible. She agrees, but is just telling me what it seemed like. Her pajama pants, which should have gone down to the floor, now barely past her knee. I suggest that what she's describing is shorts, and Clarissa appropriately chews me out for being a condescending asshole and not taking her seriously. I apologize and ask her for anything else. She says the reason this all freaked her out so much was because of the writing on the wall. In the background of the video call, all along Amber's bedroom, was freshly drawn writing. It looked like it was written in some sort of sludge, sometimes brown, sometimes red. Clarissa didn't want to guess what was being used, but both of us could hazard a guess. I kept it to myself that I had been there last night and didn't see anything on the walls. How funny would it be if I had staked out the wrong house? The answer is not funny at all. To verify I haven't made the most idiotic blunder of my career, I asked Clarissa to describe Amber's bedroom. Tidy, a pink lamp with a few band posters. The exact posters I saw through the window. I tell Clarissa that she's done incredible work to just unwind, that I'm going to take care of it, and that everything is going to be ok. There's no way I can guarantee that, but I give my vow all the same because I can handle being freaked out for the both of us. I regret getting her involved. I regret being involved. I call the Children's Aid Society and tell them I have reason to believe that a child is sick and being denied treatment. I give them what details I can and wish them good luck. I ask them if I should call 911 as well, and they say they will take care of it. It all feels too late regardless. I call my client, not sure what I'm going to say, wondering if I'm going to be honest, and tell him I told CAS that he fucking stinks as a father. Maybe I'll just demand to know the name of his god and what they are planning. I'll probably just ask if I can have the rest of my money now. It goes to the answering machine, and I choose not to leave a message because I'm not an annoying dinosaur. I sent him an email though. He doesn't answer every time I call him for hours. Eventually, it even stops ringing and goes straight to his machine. I don't hear from him all day, and I never would again. The hours of the next day dribbled by to match the rain on my windows. No updates. I'm left to my own worries, filling in the blanks with nothing but darkness. I don't even hear back from CAS, those useless fucks. I don't mean that. They're doing okay work. It's just the coffee talking. There's nothing to do but drink some more hot brews, fret, watch my car, nobody comes back, and call again and again and again. He never answers. Instead, sometime in the afternoon, I would get a call from a piggy friend who would ask me why I was the last inbound number on my client's phone. This isn't good. After explaining to him that I was hired by my client for reasons I can't divulge, he says he's going to do me a favor, and that will be the end of the blackmail. I agree, with no intention of ever honoring that bargain. He tells me my client is dead, torn apart in his mansion, along with the wife, the dog, the live-in maid. I knew that cocksucker still had servants, and a Children's Aid Society worker who was there investigating an anonymous tip. No forced entry. The daughter is still unaccounted for. The upstairs window is smashed outward. It looks like whoever did this escaped into the woods with Amber after killing the family. They've evaded capture so far, but he assures me that they'll be caught within the hour. People need to stop giving me assurances. Can't they tell that I have less than zero faith in them? He spends longer than is really necessary describing how badly the family is torn apart. The word disarticulated gets used more than once, so I'm impressed with the cop's vocabulary. There were apparently tongues rammed down the garbage disposal and intestines decorating the chandeliers, and most of the dog was found stuffed up in the dad. I'm feeling somewhat numb, so it's hard to say why I asked, but I inquired about the family photos. He stalls, trying to figure out why I would want to know that before telling me. Of course, they'd been torn right out of the walls. What else was I expecting? I thank the gruesome bugger for the update, which I can tell absolutely makes his day. He assures me he'll keep me in the loop. Oh good, this does nothing for my paranoia, and I'm sure business casual Waluigi is going to come back for me. I banish thinking about what happened to that poor fucking kid that I couldn't save by burying myself in the most mindless of tasks. I rewatch Kenny vs. Spenny, doing my level best not to think about literally anything. I finally got around to washing the windows. When I finally feel like my heart can take it, I check the news for updates. They haven't found Amber. But the weird thing is, the cops never questioned me about it. Her father had both text and email transactions with me. Plus, he had just sent me a large sum of money right before being gruesomely murdered. How was I not a suspect? But no, nothing. And that just raises more questions. Later still, I feel brave enough to check the news again, and I notice a cute little piece seemingly tucked away between more important stories. A mass suicide in a church. 2 guesses for the name of the church, the Wayward Shepherd of Guiding Flocks Church. The cops were called to investigate an excessive number of cars parked in the church's lot. Naughty them, gathering in large groups during lockdown. The crime scene footage they do show on the news shows one of the cars parked there. License plate shooty well. Isn't that just slightly familiar? A few hours later, the news seems almost annoyed that this fluff story won't just go away and begrudgingly reports on some of the people lost in the suicide. Hey, who's that handsome tan fella there? Didn't I see him snooping around my car? I also notice my bizarre-looking stretchy friend is suspiciously absent from the known dead. At least I think he is. I'm having trouble remembering his face. It's almost not worth stating that the church's website is down now. If everyone killed themselves, who took down the site? I can't help myself and call PGFREND and ask him if he knows anything about the suicide. I don't even need to threaten to blackmail him. He's happy to tell me everything. I think he assumes he's helping with one of my cases. He tells me that most of the cops on the scene have taken time off or outright quit. There are stories, but all of them are unconfirmed. Everything is very hush-hush. Classic. They say that a huge back section of the church was blown out in some sort of explosion, but they didn't find any scorch marks. They say that although every single member of the church is currently missing, not all of the bodies are accounted for. They say that they found a bunch of empty syringes lying around the bodies, and the lab boys can't make heads or tails of whatever cocktail was in them. Everybody did work for a pharmaceutical company. They had access to all the best designer drugs. They say none of the bodies have injection sites, but that doesn't mean much considering the condition of the poor bastards' bodies. They say that the suicides don't look like normal suicides. Pigfriend gets all quiet. He's telling me what he feels is the right thing to do. They say that it looks more like mass hysteria than a suicide pact. People dashing their own brains in against the concrete floor of the basement. People frantically pulling out their own throats. People plunging anything nearby into their eyes. More than one person had taken the money and credit cards out of their wallet and swallowed them, gagging themselves to death. I hear myself asking him to go on. The weirdest rumor of all, and this is all unconfirmed, he reminds me, is that 1 floor below the basement where all the bodies were found, they had made some sort of makeshift forge. They had molds in the shape of life-size, impossibly thin people, and there were remnants of gold in the molds. The technicians say there was evidence that they had melted down their jewelry into those shapes. But whatever shape they melted it down into, it was never recovered. I guess what he's about to say. They found the faintest traces of gold footprints leading out of the church. He gives me more details that I didn't ask for and don't bear repeating, but I get the gist of them. In a faraway voice, I tell him that I want to give an anonymous tip. He tells me it doesn't work like that, but after a moment of deliberation, he thinks he can make it work. I tell him to check on my ex's place. I think something awful has happened there. I can hear him scratch down the address on a piece of paper, and he doesn't even bother asking how I know. Good boy. So that seems like the best place to end this sad story of how I was paid $25,000 for a single night's work and figured out absolutely nothing. I failed the client. I failed the kid in danger. I just failed. I don't know what Amber had. Maybe she had corona. Maybe she had been poisoned by a cult. Or maybe she just had wacky old cancer. I don't know what happened in that house. Maybe Amber went crazy with whatever was making her sick. Someone grabbed her and dragged her off into the dark, unknown night. Or maybe she ran away from her parents' attackers. I don't know what happened in that church. Maybe they used their corporation to develop a drug that caused intense mania. Maybe they summoned their frustratingly nameless god and killed themselves rather than behold his wickedness. Maybe they were just a bunch of privileged cooks who got bored and killed themselves in fun and exciting ways. People do funny stuff. I can almost guarantee that the first cops on the scene stole those gold statues, though, and made up some bullshit story of gold footprints as a smokescreen of the supernatural. People also do predictable things. I don't even know what happened with my ex. There's nothing in the news, and they aren't updating their Twitter. That could be because something happened, but more than likely, they're up in the woods with piss-poor reception, waiting this whole pandemic thing out with their family. That just leaves me here, alone, in a stuffy apartment, with too many coffees and too few shots of tequila, a few months' rent tucked away in my bank account, and a nagging concern. Plus, I'm coming down with a cold. With my luck, it's COVID. Whatever just happened, whatever weird series of events I just caught a fleeting, indescribable glimpse of, they don't feel over. Maybe that's just the detective in me talking, wanting the story to keep playing out so I can see the loose ends wrapped up. Somebody has to wrap up those loose ends. I failed Amber by not getting her help fast enough, but that doesn't mean I should give up on her. She still needs to be found, and don't I run a private investigation company? We finds *** all the time. I'll sell it to my employees by telling them that there are also some missing gold statues somewhere in the mix, so if we find Amber, we will likely find those effigies, and if we find those, we can live like kings. I don't want them to think I'm going soft. I've got a reputation as a morally dubious investigator to uphold. I'll tell them to keep an eye out for a long guy who may or may not want to kill us. I'll leave out that a major medical corporation that's secretly run by a cult may have developed an insanity drug. I don't need them worrying about what's in their painkillers, especially since this case promises to be a headache. Yeah, I'm going back into the case. People do funny stuff, like needing a private investigator during quarantine.